In this video, we'll be going over spells in D&D which deal the most amount of damage, mainly talking about how much damage they can deal single target and comparative to other spells in the level. At number 10, we'll start off with the strongest cantrip, which is Toll the Dead, at 6.5 damage on average if used on a target below maximum health, and assuming no other modifiers or class abilities. Toll the Dead is a ranged cantrip which requires a target within 60 feet to do a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail, they take damage based on what their maximum health is. If they are at their maximum, then it only deals 1d8 damage. But if they are at any point below their maximum health, then it deals 1d12 damage, which is the amount you'll be doing most of the time when you use the cantrip. And 1d12 is the highest cantrip dice out of all of them baseline, only tied with another cantrip called Poison Spray. Poison Spray also deals 1d12 damage on a failed con save, although one of the big advantages Toll the Dead has over Poison Spray is that it has a much longer range of 60 feet, and targets a saving throw that a lot of monsters don't have a high stat of. Whereas Poison Spray is technically a ranged spell, but only has a 10-foot range, which means you have to get incredibly close in order to use it, and it targets a saving throw that most monsters have a high stat of, Constitution. It also deals poison damage, which a lot of monsters have resistance to, whereas necrotic damage of Toll the Dead is very rarely resisted. Although technically they do have the same damage, so even if Toll the Dead is a lot better, they basically tie for this spot on this list, as they also both scale like normal cantrips, and will do 4d12 damage at level 16+. And at number 9, we'll be going over the best first level spell in terms of pure damage, which is Inflict Wounds. That clocks in at a grand total of 16.5 damage on average. For the first 4 spots in this list, I'll be going over the best damaging spells of the first 4 levels of spells. Then for the rest of the video, I'll just be going over the tops. So, at level 1, with Inflict Wounds 3d10 damage, it barely takes the top spot. And seeing as it's a spell which requires a melee spell attack, you have to get kind of close in order to use it, although you are paid off with some of the highest amount of single target damage you can deal at level 1. If you want a ranged attack, then Jim's Magic Missiles comes in at number 2, at 15 damage on average, but has a chance to blow up in your face if any of the Magic Missiles rolls have a 1 on their attack rolls, plus requires a gold to cast each time. Guiding Bolt is a little bit more safer, dealing 14 damage on average, and also can be fired at range, although that spell is only available to one class. And if you want spells that yield the most amount of AoE damage, then Burning Hands is number 1 in that front, dealing 10.5 damage on average to each target. Although Fingers in Frost and Magnify Gravities could be considered really good alternatives, both dealing 9 damage on average for each target hit, while also having extra effects instead of just having fire damage. And at number 8, for the second level spell, we have Cloud of Daggers. Now this one needs a little bit of explaining, since Cloud of Daggers on its own only deals 10 damage on average per round. The actual highest damage dealer of the level 2 spells is Scorching Ray, which is 21 damage on average, and can be targeted to 3 separate things, or can put all 3 rays into one target. Now, the reason I have Cloud of Daggers on here is because it has the potential to deal more damage than a whole bunch of other spells until we get around the 6th level spells, because it has a distinction where, when Cloud of Daggers is formed, it will deal 4d4 damage to any target which moves into its square, or starts its turn inside the Cloud of Daggers. And there's no saving throw. It's one of the few auto-hit abilities in the game. If something enters the Cloud of Daggers, then it will automatically hit for the 10 average damage. It can also trigger the damage 1 time per turn, in addition to triggering the damage if you start your turn inside of it. Now, most AoE abilities which last for multiple turns, like Cloud of Daggers, since it can stay up for a full minute if you keep your concentration on it, have a little ruling where they don't actually do any damage when they're first applied, or when that AoE is moved into a square that another creature occupies. So, when you first spawn Cloud of Daggers, it won't do any damage to the target you put it on top of, since it has a really small, just 1 cube of space. Unless they start their turn inside of it, which they're pretty likely to do if you spawn it on top of them. However, if they move into the Cloud of Daggers while it's already there, but don't end their turn there, they still take the damage. Or if someone else moves them into the Cloud of Daggers, then they take the damage. And since there's no saving throw for that damage, you can just have someone shove another creature into the cloud, where they'll take the damage upon entering it, and then take the damage again when they start their turn inside of it. And since the damage is only once per turn and not once per full round, You can keep shoving creatures in and out of the Cloud of Daggers on separate turns in order to take advantage of the damage multiple times. Of course, the real beauty of this spell is the fact that it lasts for multiple turns. If you're able to keep something inside of a Cloud of Daggers for the full 10 rounds that it can stay up, that's around 100 damage on average without any kind of saving throws. If you cast it at 9th level, then that's 450 points of damage without a saving throw, as long as you're able to land the grapple on one of the big bad monsters, or have some way to confine them in that one space. Dropping a 9th level Cloud of Daggers on them will kill them eventually, since there's only 2 creatures in the game who are immune to slashing damage. And it's not a half bad option in order to upcast, since there aren't any other spells which do auto damage and also this much damage for one spell cast. Assuming you have a way to keep someone inside of it, of course, since it is a really small range. And at number 7, we have Fireball. Fireball deals 28 damage on average to each target hit, making it a monster of an AoE ability, which outdamages all of the single target damaging options available at 3rd level spells and lower, and isn't being out until 4th level spells when you can pick up Blight, which can deal 36 damage on average to a single target, which is only 8 more damage than a Fireball. And what's great about Fireball is that it hits a whole bunch of targets, as it has a 20-foot radius where it explodes, has a very long 100-foot range, and is one of the few spells that goes around corners, so it completely ignores cover. Although Fireball is actually tied at the 7th spot, because Lightning Bolt also deals the exact same amount of damage. Lightning Bolt also has a pretty long range too, although since Lightning Bolt is a line spell, it's a little bit harder to hit as many targets with a Lightning Bolt than you can a Fireball. Although it is easier to position a Lightning Bolt in the middle of a very cramped dungeon than it is a Fireball, so they both have their uses and they both outdamage everything else at this level and below, and don't get beaten out until 4th level spells with Blight and Vitriolic Sphere, which are the only 2 4th level spells that can deal more damage than Fireball and Lightning Bolt. You know a 3rd level spell is really strong when it deals more damage than a vast majority of spells at a higher spell level than it. Although, I will say, even though Fireball and Lightning Bolt deal excellent damage for their level, they do get beaten out if you try to upcast them by just harder hitting higher level spells. And it's at this point of the top 10 where we stop going through the spells by level and just go straight into the spells which deal the most amount of damage, comparative to their levels, of course. And at number 6, we have Finger of Death, a 7th level spell which deals 61.5 damage on average, a little over 2 times the single target damage of the 3rd level Fireball. In fact, a Fireball cast at 7th level only deals 42 damage to a single target. So, for the spell slot available to do single target damage, Finger of Death definitely wins out. Although if Fireball hits 2 or more targets at that level, it deals more damage. But this list is about single target big damage, and not the potential of AoE damage, since that adds way too many variables to the equation. Now, what Finger of Death does is you get to shoot a target within 60 feet for 7d8 plus 30 necrotic damage, assuming they fail a Constitution save, or they take half damage on a success. And if you manage to kill someone with the ability, they raise as a zombie that you permanently control. And creatures raised as zombies are much harder to resurrect than creatures that are just killed and leave a normal body behind. So if an enemy spellcaster is able to use Finger of Death, you definitely don't want to be killed by them. And since it deals so much damage, if it actually lands, there's a good chance it can kill whoever it's used on. Although, when it goes to pure, single target damage dealing spells, Finger of Death is actually being out by a couple of lower level spells, which I'll talk about in a bit. And at number 5, we have Animate Object, a 5th level spell which has the potential to deal 65 damage on average to a single target. Now, already we have a spell which is 2 full spell levels lower than Finger of Death, but is able to deal slightly more potential damage to a single target. Although the chances that you'll get all 65 damage on it is kind of a stretch. You see, what Animate Object does is it allows you to convert up to 10 non-magical objects within range into semi-living versions of themselves, who are able to attack and deal damage. Now, these animated objects can only deal non-magical bludgeoning damage, so one of the best things to use in order to animate this ability is just 10 silver coins, which really goes into the best use of the spell. You get to choose up to 10 targets, although if you choose bigger targets, it will not let you create as many. So, to get the max amount of animated objects, you want to use 10 tiny or small objects, which a silver coin counts as a tiny object, and it will also count your attacks as silvered, which allows you to pass a lot of bludgeoning resistances. The tiny objects will all have 20 HP each, a pretty impressive AC of 18, the ability to float and move 30 feet a turn, so should have no problem positioning themselves or worry about getting killed too quickly. And each one is able to deal about 6.5 damage on average, while also having a +8 to their hit, which is actually a pretty good chance to hit. So if all 10 of your floating silver coins land an attack, that's 65 points of damage on average to whatever you put them on. So with a lot of extra effort, you are able to use a 5th level spell in order to deal slightly more damage than a 7th level single target spell, making Animate Objects one of the highest damage dealing level 5 spells in the game. Single target anyway. And at number 4, we have Disintegrate, which is a 6th level spell that deals 75 damage on average. This is another spell which is a lower level than Finger of Death, a single target only, and it has an impressive 13.5 more damage on average. Although there is a big downside to Disintegrate, in that it's a save or nothing type spell. If the target you use it on succeeds its dexterity saving throw, then they take no damage at all, where at least with Finger of Death, they take half damage if they succeed. But it also has a cool effect if it lowers a target to 0 health, where them and all their equipment besides magical items get turned into dust, and they can't be resurrected except by some 9th level spells. They can also be used to instantly destroy objects in Walls of Force, so it has some uses outside of being a huge single target nuke for damage. Although, it's a pretty risky single target damage dealer, seeing as most high level spells at least do half damage if the target succeeds the saving throw, because otherwise you're wasting a pretty valuable spell slot for no damage if they do succeed. And if you use it on a monster with legendary resistances, then it's basically just using up one of those resistances where you do no damage for that turn. Whereas other spells will at least have some other minor effect if they force a high level monster to use a legendary resistance on it. And at number 3, we have Delayed Blast Fireball, which is a 7th level spell that can deal a potential 77 damage single target. And also has a benefit where it's an AoE that can hit a whole bunch of targets, since it has the same radius as Fireball. Although, there is a huge caveat to Delayed Fireball. It only deals his damage if you're able to delay it for its maximum duration of 1 minute. The way Delayed Blast Fireball works is when you use it, you create a little bead, and as long as you maintain your concentration, every 6 seconds this bead will grow in strength, and deal an additional 1d6 damage when it finally blows up, starting off at a base of 12d6. So if you're able to concentrate on the Delayed Fireball for a full minute, then when it finally explodes, it will deal 22d6 damage, which is where we get the value of 77 damage on average for single target. So it has the potential to be quite powerful, although this requires a lot of work in order to use it in an actual encounter. If you just use Delay Fireball at its base level, it will basically deal the same damage as if you have just upcasted a Fireball at 7th level. Although at that point you're just kind of wasting the spell slot, because there's much better spells to use that do a lot more damage. A Chain Lightning, for example, which is actually a spell level lower, will do more damage single target than a baseline Delayed Fireball, and is able to deal damage to up to 4 targets. Although I guess Delayed Fireball will do more damage than a Chain Lightning if it's able to hit a whole room of monsters. But if we're talking about high level spells that deal the most amount of AoE damage, Delayed Fireball doesn't even win on that front, unless it's been delayed for the full minute, of course. That's where the real power of the spell comes in, finding a way to delay for a full minute before a fight starts or something, because if you have to use it during a fight, then it's kind of beaten out by lower level spells. And at number 2, we have Mental Prison, a 6th level spell which is able to deal 82.5 damage on average, easily beating out a full Delayed Fireball, while also being 1 spell level lower. What Mental Prison does is it forces one target within 60 feet to make an intelligence saving throw. If they succeed, then they only take 5d10 psychic damage and that's the end of it. However, if they fail that saving throw, then they still take 5d10 psychic damage, but they also get restrained into Mental Prison, where they can't see or hear anything outside of it. And instead, they see a whole bunch of illusions of things that are not supposed to touch. And if they are moved out from their square, or if they reach in and touch any part of the illusion, then they immediately take 10d10 psychic damage and then the spell ends. So the full amount of damage averages out to around 82.5 damage, making it one of the highest damage dealing single target spells that's not 9th level. Although it does require a little bit of legwork in order to inflict that second portion of damage, by somehow forcing them to move at all inside the prison. Although it has an excellent saving throw of intelligence, most creatures do not have high intelligence, so there's a good chance if you use this on someone, there's a better chance of them failing the saving throw for Mental Prison than something like Disintegrate or Finger of Death, which have Constitution and Dexterity saving throws, which are much easier to beat for the average monster in the monster manual. So not only does it have the potential to deal more damage in those 2 single target spells, it also has a better saving throw as well. And even if it doesn't do the damage, it acts as an excellent form of crowd control too, while also having some damage if they do manage to succeed the saving throw, unlike Disintegrate, the other 6th level spell that deals a lot of single target damage. And now, before we go to number 1, I'll mention a couple of honorable mentions. If you want the spell which deals the most amount of damage based on number of targets hits, then it's really hard to beat Storm of Vengeance, which is a 9th level spell that has an impressive 360 foot radius, and if it's maintained for its full concentration duration, deals an average of 21 damage to each target inside of it. This is the spell you use if you want a high level spellcaster to defeat an entire army by themselves. Just have them fly on top of an army and summon a Storm of Vengeance, and unless they have an enemy spellcaster to fly up and fight you, they're basically done for. It's also a spell which you can give a villain if you're a DM in a campaign, in order to kill an entire town or village by themselves. However, it is not good at dealing single target damage though, so it's not super useful against boss fights where there's just one big dude with lots of health. Although in that case, we also have the other 9th level spell called Prismatic Wall, which if you're able to force a target to go through all 5 damaging layers it has, can deal around 175 damage on average to that target. Although that requires a lot of legwork, like trying to get someone to sit still inside of a 9th level cloud of daggers for 10 rounds, which would actually do more damage anyway. But the actual number 1 is a lot easier to use than these other 2 9th level spells anyway. And at number 1, we have Meteor Swarm, a 9th level spell which can deal 140 damage on average to a single target. And also, it's a ridiculously large AoE radius as well. What Meteor Swarm does, on an impressive 1 mile range radius, allows you to choose 4 points for 4 meteors to fall on, and each creature within a 40-foot radius of all 4 of those points, which is double the radius of Fireball I might add, will take 20 d6 fire damage and 20 d6 bludgeoning damage on a failed dexterity saving throw, or half as much on a success. And if they fail to save, that's around 140 damage on average to each person, or 70 damage on average to each person if they do succeed. Even if it fails to do the full damage, it still beats out the bottom 5 spots on this list. Although this is a 9th level spell, so that's to be expected. And since it allows you to summon 4 meteors that each have a huge radius, it can also just be used to destroy an entire army in the same way you might use Storm of Vengeance, and would probably be more effective too, since it can take out big targets as well. And Meteor Swarm does have a little limiting factor to it, where it does summon 4 meteors, but one person can only take the damage a single time. So you can't stack all 4 meteors on top of each other to make them take 140 damage 4 times. Even at only 1 meteor per person, it's still easily the highest single target damage ability in the game. Well, outside of having to jump through hoops for a couple of the other spells, while also being one of the best AoEs in the game at the same time. This thing was kind of made to just do pure damage, and it does a really good job at it. For reference, a Fireball cast at 9th level will only do 49 damage to each target on average. So just using Meteor Swarm with your 9th level spell slot instead of a Fireball is around 3 times as much damage. In this video, we'll be going over the lowest level spells that deal the most amount of damage, specifically going through level 0 to level 2 spells. And starting off at number 10, we have Toll the Dead and Poison Spray. Both of these are cantrips which deal an average damage of around 6.5 each, so they basically tie for 10th place. Now, Poison Spray is actually not that great of a cantrip despite its high damage die, because it deals one of the worst types of damage you can deal to the average creature, i.e. poison damage, and has a very short 10-foot range, and requires the creature to fail a Constitution saving throw in order to take that 1d12 damage. Constitution isn't the worst saving throw to target, but it's definitely not a good one, as most enemy creatures you'll be fighting have decent Constitution scores. Toll the Dead, on the other hand, is an excellent cantrip and probably one of the best. This one has a much more respectable 60-foot range, deals necrotic damage, which is rarely resisted, and targets a Wisdom saving throw, which a lot of creatures have a low score in on average, so you're more likely to succeed. However, Toll the Dead only deals its 1d12 necrotic damage if the target creature is not at its maximum hit point value. So if you're hitting a fresh target with Toll the Dead, it only deals 1d8 damage instead, which isn't half bad, but it's not as good as 1d12. And none of the other single target spell cantrips have a damage die quite as high as these two baseline. Although a Warlock can take a couple of invocations to increase the damage of Eldritch Blast to blow all the cantrips out of the water when it comes to damage, but we're not including that on this list. However, I will absolutely include some special circumstances to some of these things, especially if it's a common circumstance that comes up a lot, like the next spot. And at number 9, we have a 3-way tie for Sword Burst, Thunderclap, and Word of Radiance. All of these are cantrips which deal AoE damage to all targets within 5 feet of the caster. The damage they deal is only 1d6 of their associated damage type, and all of them require a saving throw. But if you're able to hit at least 2 targets with this ability, then it bypasses the damage of the number 10 spot, although only slightly. Technically, it's 2d6 damage compared to 1d12 damage if it hits 2 targets, but 2d6 damage deals higher average damage because of that additional damage die. So if you're in a situation where you have 2 or more creatures around you, and you don't want to use a spell-slotted AoE spell, or it's a whole bunch of really low HP targets, one of these 3 cantrips can beat out the damage of almost any single target damage-dealing cantrip. And situations in which you are near more than 1 target is pretty common, so I think it's reasonable enough to assume if you're using this cantrip to its full potential, or even just half of its potential, it's definitely a high damage-dealing ability. And I'll basically be counting AoE abilities based on how much damage they deal to 2 targets, because the whole point of using them is against multiple targets anyway, and it doesn't seem right to judge them based on their numbers to single target. And at number 8, we have Booming Blade. This is another cantrip, although this one works a little bit differently, whereas part of using the cantrip you have to make a melee weapon attack, and if the attack lands then it will add booming energy to the target, which doesn't do anything unless the target moves willingly more than 5 feet. In which case they'll take an additional 1d8 damage. So if you use Booming Blade with one of the highest damage dealing weapons, like a greatsword or a maul, then you're basically adding the 2d6 damage of that weapon with the 1d8 damage of the extra damage, which gives us an average of 11.5 damage on average, which is actually more damage than if one of those AoE cantrips hits 3 targets. So you have to hit 4 or more targets in order to match the damage of one Booming Blade. However, this is assuming the target moves. So if the enemy you're fighting with Booming Blade just never moves from the location, then you won't deal any extra damage at all unless you hit 5th level. Because as soon as the damage dice for this increases, Booming Blade gains an extra effect where it will deal an additional 1d8 damage immediately with that melee attack, and then the booming energy will deal an additional 2d8 damage if they move. So below level 5, if the target never moves, then you're not doing more damage than just a normal melee attack. And since using Booming Blade counts as using a cantrip, you can't actually use Booming Blade with the multi-attack action. So you can only perform that in one melee attack with that Booming Blade, unless you have a way to cast extra cantrips in a turn, like with the Sorcerer's Quicken spell. And technically, Green Flame Blade also has the same benefits as Booming Blade, although it deals slightly less damage, or deals slightly more damage if the target never moves, because it basically has the same conditions as Booming Blade, where it requires you to do a melee attack when you use the cantrip, but it also deals an extra amount of fire damage to a different target within 5 feet, equal to your spellcasting modifier. So if you have a spellcasting modifier of just 1, then you'll deal 1 extra damage to one other target, which could technically be more damage than all of Booming Blade if the target never moves. And of course, these calculations are made using a heavy 2-handed weapon, so there's no guarantee you'll be using a 2d6 damage dice with either of these. And at number 7, we have Guiding Bolt. This first level cleric spell, which simply requires an attack roll on a target within 120 feet. And if it hits the target, it deals 4d6 radiant damage, which is about 14 damage on average, and beats out a lot of second level spells in damage even. It also has a nice benefit where the next attack roll made against that target before the end of your next turn will have advantage. So the fact that it deals good damage and has an excellent benefit to it is pretty good bonus to the spell. It's not the highest damage dealing single target first level spell, but it's close enough and probably one of the best benefits out of all the other ones. I should also mention Thunderous Smite, which is a first level paladin spell, where as a bonus action you can enchant your weapon to make it deal an additional 2d6 thunder damage on their next attack that lands, and also have a chance of knocking the target 10 feet away and prone. So if you're using the maximum damage dice weapon like a greatsword or maul, that's also 14 damage on average, just like Guiding Bolt. Although Thunderous Smite requires a bonus action and one of your actions, in addition to a melee range, but the effect will last on your weapon until you basically land one of your attacks. So it's kind of hard to waste the spell slot used on this ability, whereas if you miss with Guiding Bolt, that's it. You just lose that spell slot. And at number 6, we have Jim's Magic Missiles. This is a spell from Acquisitions Incorporated and requires you to pay 1 gold every time you cast the ability. And what it does is basically just double the damage of magic missiles, except instead of automatically hitting like Magic Missile does, it requires you to perform an attack roll for every target you want that magic missile to hit. And if any of these magic missiles rolls a 1 on their d20, then all of them will miss, blow up in your face, and deal 1 damage to you for each magic missile that exploded. So it technically has the potential to deal 15 damage on average, even more if any of them crit, as it deals an additional 1d4 damage on top of the double damage on those crits. But there is the risk that it will just do nothing and damage you instead. So overall, high risk, high reward, extra damage on crits, self-damage on critical failures, and the requirement of paying a gold for every cast. And at number 5, we have Inflict Wounds. This is another first level spell, and another one only usable by clerics, which deals 16.5 damage on average, although it requires melee range and a melee spell attack to land. So it's harder to use than Guiding Bolt, but deals slightly more damage, easily being the highest damage dealing single target first level spell in the game, and beating out pretty much all the other single target second level spells, like Melf's Acid Arrows, which only deals 15 damage on average. Clerics have some surprisingly hard-hitting single-target spells. And at number 4, we have Scorching Ray. This is a second-level spell which deals 21 damage on average. It is easily the highest damage-dealing single-target potential spell on this list, and is the only single-target second-level spell that beats the damage of Inflict Wounds, the first-level spell. Although Scorching Ray kind of works like Jim's Magic Missiles, where you have to land 3 attack rolls in order to deal its maximum damage. You see, you can target up to 3 creatures with Scorching Ray, or the same creature 3 times or whatever, and then each creature will take 2d6 fire damage if that attack lands. So if you just put all 3 of them into one target, that's 66 fire damage. So Scorching Ray could kind of be considered an AoE, or at least a multi-target ability, but it's not going to do extra damage if you hit multiple targets. You're just splitting its damage between targets. There is a difference, because the next 3 spots on this list can beat Scorching Ray in damage if used on more targets. And at number 3, we have Burning Hands. This is actually a first level spell, which deals 3d6 fire damage to all targets that fail their saving throw within a 15-foot cone in front of you, which is only 10.5 damage on average. But if you hit at least 2 targets, then it matches the damage potential of Scorching Ray. And if you hit 3 targets, then it deals 50% more damage than Scorching Ray. And then it just keeps doing more and more damage the more targets you can hit, with it being able to hit around 6+ targets within its cone if they're all huddled together pretty tightly. It's not the biggest, best AoE in the world. In fact, most people call it one of the worst first level spells because of how small it is, and the fact that it deals fire damage, which is very commonly resisted or immune. But it is the highest damage dealing AoE at first level, and beats out the highest damage dealing single target second level spell by simply hitting 2 or more targets. And at number 2, we have Cloud of Daggers. This is a second level spell which only deals 10 damage on average, but has the potential to deal the most amount of damage out of pretty much all the other spots on this list. You see, Cloud of Daggers basically occupies 1 square, and any creature who enters that square or starts their turn inside of it will take 4d4 slashing damage. And what's notable about Cloud of Daggers is the fact that there's no saving throw. It's one of the few forms of automatic damage in the game, so you're guaranteed to land this damage if you throw it on top of something. Although when you spawn Cloud of Daggers, it won't actually do any damage until the creature starts its turn. Now, the damage potential of Cloud of Daggers comes in the fact that it can deal its damage once a turn, but not once a full round. And the damage can be triggered if you push the creature into the Cloud of Daggers. So if you simply just have your party members coordinate pushing a creature into a Cloud of Daggers on each of their turns, it will deal that 10 automatic damage each time your allies push a creature into it. Or if you just hold a creature inside a Cloud of Daggers, you can deal that 10 automatic damage every turn for 1 full minute, which is around 60 guaranteed damage. And since the damage potential of this is limited only by the amount of turns that your allies can push creatures into it, it easily has the highest damage potential of pretty much all the spells on this list, including a lot of really high level spells too. But the average group isn't going to be optimizing for a Cloud of Daggers damage, so it's more of an imaginary number situation, where the potential is there, but you're realistically not going to be doing it. Whereas it's pretty realistic to expect at least 2 or more targets to get hit by a Burning Hands, for example. So Cloud of Daggers is only at number 2 on this list rather than number 1, because number 1 spot is a little bit easier to hit its actual maximum potential. And at number 1, we have Shatter and Agathys Scorcher. These are 2 second level spells which deal AoE damage, and deal an average of 13.5 damage to each target hit. Shatter will hit all creatures within a 10-foot radius sphere, and Agathys Scorcher will hit everything within a 30-foot line. So if you're able to hit at least 2 targets with either of these 2 spells, then it deals more damage than Scorching Ray, and obviously more damage than Burning Hands. However, as soon as you hit 3rd level spell slots, both of these immediately stop becoming useful, unless you only have 2nd level spell slots to spend, because both of them are just vastly worse versions of Firebolt or Lightning Bolt. 2 3rd level spells, which deal about 2 times as much damage while also covering 2 to 3 times as much radius. Although at least Shatter has a unique damage type being Thunder, so that might be useful, including its use against destroying objects. But Agathys Scorcher kind of has the same problems as Burning Hands, in that it deals fire damage, but at least it's a much longer range of 30 feet, rather than the pretty small 15-foot cone. Although since it's a line spell, that's also kind of hard to position for maximum AoE damage. But when it comes to highest damage dealing level 2 and lower spells, and without jumping through hoops in order to get the maximum damage like with Cloud of Daggers, you can't really beat Shatter and Agathys Scorcher. Especially since you just need to hit at least 2 targets with either of them to outdamage everything else on this list, which is why they're at number 1. In today's video, we're going to go over some of the strongest area of effect spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5e that deal the most amount of damage. For the purposes of this video, we'll be including some spells that have lingering effects but can still do damage. For these spells in particular, we'll be assuming 3 rounds of combat and up to 5 targets in the spell's area. This is because some spells, like the 2nd level spell Cloud of Daggers, doesn't deal its damage until the start of a creature's turn or when a creature first enters the area rather than being all upfront damage. Also, all damage calculated will be rounded down for the sake of simplicity, and the fact that the game rounds down decimals anyway, but mostly for simplicity's sake. With that out of the way, let's get started. Immediately starting this list off is our first 2-way tie between Sunbeam, a 6th level spell, and Draconic Transformation, a 7th level spell. Both of these spells require concentration maintain, last up to 1 minute, and deal an average of 27 damage per turn, for a total of around 81 damage when used 3 turns in a row. However, both spells serve different functions from one another. Sunbeam deals radiant damage in a 5-foot wide, 60-foot line, and can blind creatures it hits while also providing a bit of temporary light source if you're caught in a dark area. Meanwhile, Draconic Transformation allows for some more flexibility by allowing you to use a Dragon Breath weapon attack that covers a 60-foot cone and deals force damage, the least resistant damage type in the game. But there are also some other major differences between these 2 spells. The first is that Sunbeam requires creatures to make Constitution saving throws in order to not be blinded and only take half damage, which can hinder the performance of the spell since a lot of creatures, especially beasts, tend to have high Constitution scores. Draconic Transformation, meanwhile, requires dexterity saving throws, which, while not as bad, definitely makes the more consistent spell for damage. Not only that, but Draconic Transformation also allows you to use your bonus action in order to use the breath weapon feature of the spell, as opposed to needing to use your action like Sunbeam does, meaning you can couple Draconic Transformation with other spells like Fireball or Lightning Bolt on the same turn for a higher uptick in damage per round. However, the biggest difference between the 2 spells would have to be all the extra features that Draconic Transformation gives you whenever you cast it. Along with the breath weapon feature, you are also guaranteed Draconic wings that give you a fly speed of 60 feet, boosting your mobility significantly for the duration of the spell. You're also granted blind sight of up to 30 feet, which isn't as useful, but allows you to see invisible creatures within that range, even if you're blinded, unless the creature successfully hides from you. At the end of the day, however, both of these spells basically do the same damage, assuming creatures fail their saving throws against them. And against 5 creatures, that's a whopping 405 damage in 3 turns. But if you had to pick between the 2, it's almost always more beneficial to use Draconic Transformation under every circumstance, purely because of its combo potential with other spells. And at number 9, we have Ravenous Void and Tsunami. Ravenous Void is a 9th level concentration spell that's only available to Chronergy and Graviturgy wizards, and allows you to create a 20-foot radius sphere at a point you can see within 1,000 feet of yourself for up to 1 minute. When this happens, the space inside the sphere and the area around it within 100 feet becomes difficult terrain. The sphere also pulls in objects from the same 100-foot area at the start of each of your turns and instantly destroys them as long as they aren't being worn or carried. And if a creature starts its turn within this 100 feet area, they must make a strength saving throw in order to avoid being pulled into the center of the sphere, where they will instantly take 5d10 force damage and become restrained until it can escape from inside the sphere by either teleporting out of it, or using their action in order to make a strength check against your spell save DC in order to be able to try and walk out of the sphere, which is still considered difficult terrain. On average, this deals around 27 force damage per target, which adds up to around 82 damage over 3 turns. So with 5 targets inside of the sphere, that's a total of 137 force damage in a single turn, and 412 force damage total after these 3 turns have passed, which is 7 points higher than what Sunbeam and Draconic Transformation can achieve. What's notable about this spell, however, is that this spell has a really good way of consistently dealing its damage by virtue of pulling in creatures outside of its damage radius. Even if a creature manages to break free of the restraint and manages to get out of the sphere, they're still dealing with 100 feet of difficult terrain, and will have to make another strength saving throw in order to not get pulled into the sphere, taking damage and becoming strained once more in the process. Overall, this is just a really powerful spell with very good crowd control capabilities if you're in an open enough area to not get pulled in yourself. And the damage is reliable too, since most creatures in the game don't resist force damage in general. However, the main drawback is the fact that only Chronergy and Graviturgy wizards are the only subclass that can technically learn this spell, unless your DM allows you to learn Dunamancy spells in some other way, or allows them in general. Meanwhile, Tsunami works a bit differently. The first obvious difference is that Tsunami is an 8th level concentration spell that has a casting time of 1 minute, and is only available to druids. The second thing to note is that Tsunami only requires you to see the area you want to place it, rather than the 1,000 foot range that Ravenous Void has. And the rules on outdoor visibility can be found on page 243 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, which states that, when traveling outdoors, characters can see about 2 miles in any direction on a clear day, or until the point where trees, hills, or other obstructions block their view, which gives Tsunami effectively 2 miles of range in an open field. Furthermore, on a clear day, the characters can see 40 miles if they're atop a mountain or a tall hill, or aren't otherwise able to look down at an area around them from a height, which further increases the range you can use the spell. As for what this spell does specifically, it creates a wall of water that can be up to 300 feet high, 300 feet long, and 50 feet thick, and lasts for up to 6 rounds. And when the Tsunami first appears, all creatures in that area must make a strength saving throw, or take 6d10 bludgeoning damage, halved on a success. This equals around 33 points of damage on average. However, unlike the other spells that deal lingering damage, Tsunami deals its damage a little bit differently in the fact that the damage is reduced by 1d10 for every round the Tsunami is up, while also reducing its height by 50 feet. The trade-off, however, comes in the form of movement, where the Tsunami will also move 50 feet away from you, engulfing and damaging huge or smaller creatures that are already inside the Tsunami, or those that get caught up inside of it when it moves. Also, creatures that are trapped inside can't move unless they pass an athletics check against your spell save DC, and they're limited to swimming when doing so. As such, the average damage over 3 rounds of the spell ends up being 33 to start, followed by 27.5, and ending with 22 damage on the 3rd round, equaling 82 when rounded down, the same as Ravenous Void, which ends up being a total of 412 damage against 5 targets as well. Overall, both of these spells are excellent when dealing damage to large groups of creatures. However, Tsunami's 1 minute cast time makes it a lot more niche and harder to use as opposed to Ravenous Void's 1000 feet range and 1 action cast time that also constantly pulls creatures towards it over a large area. However, because of how exclusive both of these spells are from one another, it's not really worth comparing the two, since the only way to have both of these spells is by having 2 completely differently built characters, meaning you can just have both amongst the entire party if you really wanted to. And at number 8, we have another 2-way tie between Insect Plague and Dawn, 2 5th level concentration spells that deal 4d10 damage on average, or around 22 damage, to all creatures in an area over their durations. As for the specific function of each spell, Insect Plague creates a 20-foot radius sphere centered at a point you choose within 300 feet of you, creating a lightly obscured area that also counts as difficult terrain for up to 10 minutes. Whenever you first cast this spell, however, creatures have to make a Constitution saving throw or take 4d10 piercing damage, and will also have to make the same saving throw when entering the area for the first time, or when ending their turn within the sphere. The same thing happens with Dawn, except it creates a 30-foot radius, 40-foot high cylinder for 1 minute with 60 feet of you, and sheds bright light, which counts as sunlight and deals radiant damage instead of piercing. As with Insect Plague, creatures make a Constitution saving throw when the spell first appears, but unlike Insect Plague, only have to make an additional saving throw if they end their turn inside the cylinder, rather than when a creature first enters it. You can also move the cylinder up to 60 feet as a bonus action whenever you need to, which can be useful for blocking off choke points or forcing creatures to reposition themselves. As for the damage of these spells, an average of 22 damage doesn't seem all that much, especially considering the fact that Ravenous Void deals 27 points of damage every time it affects a creature. However, what separates these 2 spells from those spells is the fact that both Insect Plague and Dawn have initial damage whenever they are cast, giving both spells 1 additional tick of damage over 3 rounds, meaning they get to deal damage up to 4 times instead of 3 if you manage to fulfill the right conditions and are able to deal damage consistently to the targets. So this means that, with 5 targets, both Insect Plague and Dawn would be dealing an average of 440 damage over 3 turns, which is 28 more damage than Ravenous Void can do. However, these two spells would be less consistent since there's not really a way for these two spells to hold creatures down to achieve this damage on their own like Ravenous Void can do. But the damage potential is still there, and the initial casting is quite useful when you want to deal immediate damage to a group of enemies, while also having a little bit of utility attached to it. In the end, it's really dependent on whatever you might need for a situation. Is obscuring an area and creating difficult terrain in a fixed location going to benefit you more than a brightly sunlit cylinder that you can move around to scramble enemy positions, and to be able to lock down a new area of return as a bonus action? Whatever the case, you're still guaranteed to deal pretty decent damage with either of these spells if you manage to get more than 1 tick of damage off of them. And at number 7, we have Wall of Fire. This is a 4th level concentration spell that creates a wall of fiery inferno at a point within 120 feet of you, and deals 5d8 fire damage to creatures when it first created. Half if they successfully make a dexterity saving throw, which is an average of 22.5 damage. And just like Dawn and Insect Plague, Wall of Fire deals initial damage followed by damage on a creature's turn. Specifically, whenever they end their turn inside the wall's damage range, which is chosen by the caster. The way this works is, the caster must choose which side of the wall deals the damage. Then every square within 10 feet of that side of the wall will subject creatures that end their turn inside it to further fire damage. This damage doesn't actually require a saving throw to avoid. Only creatures that are inside the wall when it first appears to make the saving throw, making this an excellent way to deal some guaranteed damage to a group of enemies. The wall itself can be made as a straight opaque wall of fire up to 60 feet long, 20 feet high, and 1 foot thick, or a ringed wall up to 20 foot in diameter and 1 foot thick, both of which last for up to 1 minute. This spell can be used as a means of trapping enemies inside a dome, letting them cook from inside the wall until they move out of it, or as a means to force creatures to come to you by moving into the wall, since this spell blocks line of sight for most spells, so they can't just teleport past it. The damage of this spell is nearly identical damage to Insect Plague and Dawn on average, being only 0.5 more per target. So just this once we'll be ignoring the rule to round down, since this does affect the overall damage once 3 turns have passed. Against 5 creatures, Wall of Fire deals 112.5 fire damage on average, and since this spell ticks 4 times by round 3, that means the overall damage averages to around 450 fire damage total, which ends up being 10 more points than Dawn and Insect Plague. Overall, Wall of Fire is an excellent crowd control option to use to separate groups of enemies from the fight, unless they want to take unavoidable fire damage. And at number 6, we have Blade Barrier. This is a 6th level concentration spell that is only found in the Cleric spell list, and creates a wall of magical blades that can be made in a straight line, or ringed wall much like Wall of Fire. When making a straight wall, the dimensions are 100 feet long, 20 feet high, and 5 feet thick, while the ring version has a 60 foot diameter with the 2 latter dimensions being the same. The Blade Barrier also creates difficult terrain in the spaces it covers. Creatures that enter its area for the first time on a turn, or start its turn inside, they must make a dexterity saving throw or take 60-10 slashing damage, half as much on a success. This averages out to 33 slashing damage per target. Over 3 rounds, that's about 99 slashing damage on average, and 495 slashing damage if you manage to consistently hit 5 targets, which is a whopping 45 damage higher than what Wall of Fire achieves. It is worth noting that because this is on the Cleric spell list only, it actually makes for a pretty decent crowd control option for Clerics, since it deals a lot of damage and difficult terrain while also getting 3/4 covers to creatures behind it, essentially giving you and your allies a +5 bonus to AC and dexterity saving throws. While this does also apply to enemies behind the Blade Barrier, you would technically have more advantage because you get to choose where to set up the Blade Barrier. So if you manage to place this spell in a position that's favorable to you and your allies, you can effectively force ranged creatures to walk through the Blade Barrier since they'd have a hard time hitting you otherwise. Overall, an excellent damaging spell for Clerics to have that provides both damage and utility in ways not many other spells provide. Rolling around number 5 on this list, we have the 7th level concentration spell, Whirlwind. You choose a point on the ground within 300 feet of you that you can see, and conjure up a 30 foot high, 10 foot radius cylinder centered around that point you choose, which sucks up any unsecure medium-sized to smaller objects that aren't being worn or carried. And as an action on each of your turns, you can move that whirlwind up to 30 feet in any direction along the ground, sucking up objects and creatures in its path and dealing damage to them along the way, by forcing creatures to make dexterity saving throws each time they're subject to the damaging portion of the spell. Basically, when this spell is first cast, creatures inside of it take 10d6 bludgeoning damage, or an average of 35 damage if they fail a dexterity saving throw. But unlike other spells that linger in an area or can be moved around, it also deals damage when it enters the spaces of any creatures while it moves. And every time they fail the dexterity saving throw, the affected creatures must also make a strength saving throw or become restrained until the whirlwind ends and is moved 5 feet higher each time a creature starts its turn inside of it, only stopping once it's reached the top of the whirlwind. However, a creature restrained by whirlwind will also move with it and will fall when the spell ends, unless they have a way to stay in the air, such as through the means of flight. However, a restrained creature can use its action to make a strength or dexterity check against your spell save DC to try and free themselves off the restraint, but at the cost of being flung 3d6 times 10 feet away from the whirlwind into a random direction, subjugating the creature to additional fall damage if they were lifted up at least 10 feet off the ground, up to a maximum of 3d6 extra bludgeoning damage at 30 feet. As for the overall damage of the spell against 5 targets, Whirlwind has a damage potential of around 525 damage on average, which is 30 points higher than what Blade Barrier can achieve. However, doing so can be kind of hard simply because of how the spell is worded. Basically, the only time this spell does damage is when the whirlwind first appears, or whenever it enters the space of another creature, or if a creature enters the whirlwind space. And since creatures trapped inside of the whirlwind also move with the spell if you choose to move it, you can't really do repeated damage to it after the first time it takes damage, unless that creature not only fails the saving throw against the damage, but actually succeeds being restrained by the whirlwind, because a creature that isn't restrained by the whirlwind can't be moved with it if you choose to do so. This would essentially allow you to move the whirlwind away from the creature on your turn and place it back on them if they choose to remain inside of the whirlwind, or just move the whirlwind back onto the creature if they moved out of it, thus provoking another saving throw against the whirlwind's damage. So if you're going to use this spell in order to deal a lot of damage to creatures, it's actually better to use this spell against creatures with a good strength stat so that they repeatedly deal damage to them in a short amount of time. Of course, you could also wait to see if a creature breaks out of the restraint on their own and chase after them with a spell, but since you can only move the whirlwind 30 feet a turn, it might not be the best to do so in case they get flung more than 30 feet away. Overall, this spell remains on this list due to damage potential alone rather than consistency. And since this spell is available to druids, sorcerers, and wizards, Whirlwind is a flexible tool that is readily available and immediately useful for blowing away expectations of your competition. And at number 4, we have Maddening Darkness. This is an 8th level concentration spell that spreads magical darkness from a point you choose within 150 feet of you, filling this spot with a 60-foot radius sphere for a duration up to 10 minutes. The darkness blocks visibilities from creatures that do not have a means to see through magical darkness, such as through Devil's Sight, a Warlock's Invocation, or a creature that doesn't rely on sight, such as creatures that possess Blind Sight. In addition to that, light can't illuminate the darkness, even spells of 8th level or lower that shed light cannot illuminate the area. And creatures that find themselves inside of this darkness will also hear a series of shrieks, gibbering, and mad laughter. And if they start their turn inside of the sphere, they have to make a wisdom saving throw or else they take 8d8 psychic damage whenever they fail, half on a success. This averages to about 36 psychic damage per target hit, which in turn goes up to around 108 damage over 3 rounds if the target remains inside the darkness. So for 5 creatures that manage to be trapped inside, this adds up to around an average of 540 psychic damage over 3 turns, which is 15 points higher than Whirlwind can achieve, and way more consistent. Raw damage-wise, Maddening Darkness does sport a higher damage potential than any of the previous contenders so far, so it's worth putting on this list for that alone. And at number 3, we have Dark Star. This is an 8th level concentration spell that's only available to Chronergy and Graviturgy wizards due to being a Dunamancy spell. What it does is it allows you to create a sphere centered on a point you choose within 150 feet. This sphere's radius is determined by the one who casts it and can be as big as 40 feet, filling the air with magical darkness and a crushing gravitational force. This sphere also creates difficult terrain inside of it, and, just like Maddening Darkness, blocks visibility inside of it even if a creature has dark vision. But in addition to that, sound can't be created or passed through the area, which is important for spells that require a vocal component in order to use. Creatures inside the sphere are also deafened and immune to thunder damage, and if they start their turn inside the sphere or enter it for the first time, they have to make a Constitution saving throw in order to try and take half of 8d10 force damage, which averages to about 44 force damage on a target that takes the full damage. Over 3 rounds, this averages to 132 force damage per target, adding up to 660 damage overall against 5 targets. This is a significant jump of 120 points of damage between the spell and Maddening Darkness, while also possessing a more consistent way to keep creatures inside of it by making difficult terrain inside the sphere, and also providing a bit of utility by preventing those creatures from using spells with verbal components, which encompasses most spells in the game. Taking the runner-up spot on this list is Meteor Swarm, surprisingly enough. This is a 9th level spell that allows you to conjure 4 meteors at 4 different points of your choosing within a whole mile. The impact radius of each meteor is 40 feet and forces creatures to make dexterity saving throws. On a failure, they take 20d6 fire damage and 20d6 bludgeoning damage for a total of 40d6 damage, which averages out to around 140 damage per target hit. Otherwise, creatures hit will only take half damage from either damage type. It's important to note that creatures can only be affected by one impact from the spell, so stacking and overlapping the radius of the meteors is effectively useless. Instead, you'd want to cover as much of the area as possible to inflict the maximum amount of damage. This spell also damages objects and ignites things not being worn or carried, so it can be a nice option to lay siege on certain enemy structures and the like, which gives Meteor Swarm a niche use outside of its raw damage. Speaking of raw damage, if you manage to hit 5 targets, which is admittedly easy given the insane radius of each meteor, you're looking at around an average of 700 total damage in a single turn, which is by far the highest amount of damage a spell can do in a single turn outright. And if this list was about being able to deal the most amount of damage in a single turn, Meteor Swarm will always win by a country mile. And with its given range, it would do the most damage to the most targets in a single turn given its massive area of effect. However, given enough time to cook, the next spell actually can deal more damage than Meteor Swarm, a bleed on less targets overall. And this spell that took number 1 spot on this list is Incendiary Cloud. Just like many of the other cloud-like spells on this list, Incendiary Cloud creates a 20-foot radius sphere centered on a point within 150 feet of you for up to 1 minute, heavily obscuring the area with spicy smoke that deals 10d8 fire damage when it appears. And whenever a creature first enters or ends its turn within the fiery cloud, they have to make a successful dex save in order to take half the damage. As an added bonus, the cloud also moves 10 feet away from you in a direction to choose at the start of each of your turns, which isn't much, but can be useful in these situations where you might want to move it towards an enemy that might be cornered. However, the downside of the spell is that you don't really want to use it in an area with moderate wind speeds, because that will disperse the cloud, instantly ending the spell. On average, this spell deals around 45 fire damage per target on average, and since this spell will deal damage 4 times over 3 rounds due to the fact that it not only deals initial damage with its first cast, but also when a creature ends its turn within the cloud, this spell could theoretically deal 180 fire damage total to a single target that manages to stay inside of it. And against 5 targets, that's easily an average of over 900 fire damage over 3 rounds, making this the highest damaging spell in the game if you can manage to keep creatures inside of it. However, if we're going for single one-time bursts of damage, then Meteor Swarm just wins every single time. Upcasting spells in D&D allows you to use higher level spell slots to cast spells of lower level. This is useful whenever you need a specific spell but have expended all of your lower level spell slots. But some spells gain additional benefits when cast at higher levels. And on this list, we're going to go over the spells that get the most benefit out of being upcasted. Kicking us off at number 10, we have Bestow Curse. Bestow Curse is a 3rd level necromancy spell. It takes 1 action to cast, has a range of touch, and lasts for up to 1 minute with concentration. The creature you bestow a curse on makes a wisdom saving throw. If they succeed, nothing happens. But if they fail, a whole slew of bad things befall them. They are cursed with disadvantage on saving throws and ability checks that use an ability score of your choice. You usually pick Wisdom because the next downside is that on the start of every turn, the curse makes the creature make a Wisdom saving throw which causes them to waste their action to do nothing on a failure. It also specifically makes them worse against you in a fight, as they do an extra 1d8 damage with your attacks and they have disadvantage to attack you. Now, Bestow Curse isn't considered a particularly good debuff spell at its base level. All of these effects are good, but the single target nature, the concentration, and the lack of any range makes it kind of a risky proposition when there are potentially more powerful spells to throw at 3rd level. But Bestow Curse, while a middling 3rd level spell, is a potentially amazing upcasted spell. When you upcast it at 4th level, the duration increases to 10 minutes with concentration. This doesn't really fix the major problems, but when you upcast it to 5th level, the duration becomes 8 hours with no concentration necessary. And this is one of the absolute best things you could ever give a debuff spell, or any concentration spell for that matter. Removing concentration makes Bestow Curse as a 5th level spell unique among seriously debilitating debuff spells. Nearly every debuff spell as powerful as Bestow Curse will require concentration no matter what spell slot you use. With Bestow Curse, you can completely hamstring a creature and then throw another concentration spell on them, perhaps targeting that wisdom saving throw they'll be struggling with. Now, there is an argument that a single target 5th level spell that does nothing on a successful save isn't worth it compared to more reliable control spells. But there's no doubt that Bestow Curse upcasting benefits, removing concentration, makes it one of the most improved spells by upcasting. A lot of people only consider Bestow Curse worth casting at all as a 5th level spell because of that, as it's such a marked improvement on an otherwise underwhelming spell. Also, it's worth noting that it gets further benefits for upcasting past 5th level. At 7th level, the duration increases to 24 hours, and at the final upcasting of the 9th level spell slot, it becomes permanent until magically removed. Not quite as game-changing as removing concentration, but it would be quite nasty for whoever you decide to curse. Next up at number 9, we have Moonbeam. Moonbeam is a 2nd level evocation spell. It has a 5-foot radius stretching 40 feet into the air in a cylinder. It takes 1 action to cast, has a range of 120 feet, and a duration of 1 minute with concentration. Moonbeam's effect is fairly straightforward. Any creature who enters the area of effect for the first time on their turn, or starts their turn there, makes a Constitution saving throw. On a failure, they take 2d10 radiant damage, or half as much on a save. You can move the area of effect every turn with your action, up to 60 feet, letting you move it onto new targets when necessary. Now, typically, damage-based spells are some of the worst options to upcast. As prominent example, Fireball going from 8d6 fire damage to 9d6 fire damage is pretty low impact on the spell's overall power. Unless you're hitting an absurd number of creatures, 1d6 is not worth a better spell slot most of the time. But Moonbeam has the right combination of qualities to get the most out of an upcast for a damaging spell. Firstly, Moonbeam has very high damage dice for a damage spell with d10s. So when you upcast it, it gains 1d10 extra damage for each spell slot, which already makes it a lot better than most other damage spells. 3d10 is a significant damage increase over 2d10. But what's more important is that Moonbeam does damage over the course of multiple turns. This lets you apply those extra d10s every single turn on potentially multiple enemies, getting more and more value for upcast every turn it stays active. Comparing it to the primary 3rd level damaging spells like Fireball or Lightning Bolt, you can get a whole lot more damage out of the same spell slot with an upcasted Moonbeam. Those damage spells average 28 damage on 8d6, while 3rd level Moonbeam does average a smaller 16.5 damage on 3d10, but you do get to add 16.5 average every single turn without expending any more spell slots. 2 turns of Moonbeam and you're already passing up a Lightning Bolt on average damage. Moonbeam does have some downsides of needing concentration and having a smaller area of effect, but that turns it into a situational decision more than anything. Moonbeam competing with game-changing damage spells like Fireball and Lightning Bolt really shows just how good an upcast it can be. Honorable mentions go out to similar spells like Chain Lightning, Heat Metal, or Flaming Sphere, which each have some of the qualities of Moonbeam but either don't get as much damage per level or have more restrictions on when they can be used. And with the number 8 spot on this list, we have Hold Person. Hold Person is a 2nd level enchantment spell. It takes 1 action to cast, has a range of 60 feet, and a duration of 1 minute with concentration. Hold Person allows you to target a humanoid and force them to make a wisdom saving throw. On failure, they're paralyzed for the duration. Hold Person on its own is an incredibly powerful spell due to how rare and deadly paralysis is in D&D. It allows anyone who hits the paralyzed creature in melee to automatically deal critical hit damage, making it incredibly lethal. One of the main limitations of Hold Person is it's only good for potentially taking down one opponent. If they make their save, it can cost you your turn for nothing. But with upcasting, you can help minimize this problem. The main thing you want out of upcasting is to get as much bang for your buck out of expending the higher level spell slot. Hold Person does this by effectively doubling its power every time you upcast it. Every level you upcast Hold Person allows you to target an additional humanoid within 30 feet of your original target. So as a 3rd level spell, you target 2, as a 4th level spell, you target 3, and so on and so on. This turns Hold Person from a debilitating single target spell to a multi-target control spell. It also increases the likelihood someone will suffer the effects of the spell thanks to hitting more targets, getting a lot more consistent use out of your action. Each spell slot increase is like casting a full additional spell that would already be worth your action in most cases. This holds true for Hold Person's higher level variation, Hold Monster, that works on anything but undead. Though Hold Monster is a 5th level spell and upcasting it to a 6th level and 7th level is a bit more pricey compared to Hold Person when it comes to upcasting value. In both cases, you're transforming a single target control spell, for functionality, into an area of effect one. And nothing scales better than hitting more than one target. Next up at number 7 on our list, we have Major Image. This spell is a 3rd level illusion spell. It has a range of 120 feet, a duration up to 10 minutes with concentration. Major Image is a bit of a complicated spell, but it boils down to create an illusion up to a size of a 20-foot cube. The illusion can create sounds, smells, and temperatures on top of its visual imitation to make it more convincing. Though physically interact with it reveals it as any creature that touches it will pass through the illusion. You can also actively move and change it while you maintain concentration, allowing you to make the illusion appear like it's doing nearly anything, such as having a creature carry on a conversation or transforming into something else. Illusions are very tricky to use, but when used correctly are incredibly versatile. The more convincing and creative you make an illusion, the more you can do with it so long as the creatures you're trying to fool aren't immune to the illusion or make a successful investigation check against your spell save DC to discern it. Major Image is one of the most unique upcasting benefits in the game. If you upcast Major Image with a 6th level spell slot or higher, the illusion becomes permanent. This completely changes the nature of the spell on a fundamental level. With a 5th level or lower spell slot, it's just a temporary short-term magical deception. But with that 6th level or higher, suddenly you can start putting illusions anywhere, doing anything permanently. You can create an illusion of a dangerous monster like a beholder defending your base of operations to scare away would-be intruders. You can permanently disguise an entrance to a location to make it nearly impossible to find for anyone who doesn't know where it's at. Just like a regular major image, an upcasted major image is only limited by your imagination, but in an entirely different dimension of use cases. It's not just a better version of the spell, it's basically an entirely new spell because of how much nature of the spell changes from becoming permanent. Appearing at number 6 on this list, we have Invisibility. Invisibility is a second level illusion spell. It takes 1 action to cast on a creature you touch and has a duration of 1 hour with concentration. Invisibility is one of the most effective and widely used utility spells in the game. Making yourself and your allies invisible allows for characters to sneak into areas they otherwise couldn't or surprise enemies from seemingly nowhere. The biggest downside of invisibility is that oftentimes when you use it, you end up having to split the party up, waiting for the invisible creature to finish their sneaking before executing any action as a team. But that's where upcasting can solve your problem. By upcasting invisibility, you can target an additional creature for each additional increase in spell slot. So at 3rd level, you can target 2 creatures, at 4th level, you can target 3 creatures, and so on and so on. This is one of the few ways in the game you can make an entire party that might not have the best stealth capabilities across the team, all capable of stealthing together. Even though a 5th level spell would normally be needed to achieve a group stealth on an average 4-person party, if you have 2 people who can cast invisibility, then you can get away with only having 2 3rd level spells instead. Or if someone in your party is so stealthy they don't need invisibility, that means you can pull off a total group stealth with less investment, all thanks to invisibility being able to be upcasted. You can get a lot of value out of this. Making your entire party invisible is one of the best ways to inflict surprise on your enemies. Getting a functionally free round of combat before your opponents do anything is usually game over for the opposition, especially as anyone attacking from invisibility usually gets advantage on their first attack on top of everything else. Upcasting invisibility upgrades the purpose of the spell from a single target scouting and assassination tool to a group combat buff. Upcasting doubling the effectiveness with every spell slot and adding an entirely new avenues of gameplay to already one of the best utility spells in the game makes it a great spell to consider using high level spell slots on. And at number 5 on this list, we have Banishment. Banishment is a 4th level abjuration spell. It takes 1 action to cast, has a range of 60 feet, and lasts for 1 minute with concentration. Banishment is a very powerful control spell. It targets a creature's charisma save, one of the most commonly weak saves for enemies, and on a failure, the target is shunned away to another dimension for the duration. Nothing happens on a successful save, and if the target is native to another plane of existence, they'll be shunted there. For instance, a demon would be shunted back to the abyss. If not, they go into a harmless pocket dimension. Creatures native to other planes of existence can be permanently banished if you keep them banished for the full 1 minute duration. Otherwise, when the spell ends, the creature returns to the space they were in when they were banished or the nearest unoccupied space if they can't return to their original one. Banishment is much like a previous spell in this list, Hold Person, in that it's a control spell that targets an additional creature for each level you upcast the spell. Interestingly, unlike Hold Person, the additional targets don't need to be within 30 feet of the original target, making Banishment's upcasting a little bit better as you get to fully use the multiple targets with Banishment's 60-foot range. On top of that, Banishment is just a potentially more game-changing spell to affect multiple creatures. It works on any type of creature, making the multiple target function a lot less conditional, as it'll work on any combination of creature types. Even Hold Person fails on undead, but Banishment doesn't. On top of that, the condition to permanently banish a creature that's from another plane comes up a decent amount of time around the levels you would have access to the spell, and it becomes more common as you level up and gain higher access to spell slots to upcast it. You'll find a large number of fiends, aberrations, celestials, fae, and elementals originate from other planes. So a not insignificant percentage of the time, this goes from being an upcast for multiple target control spell to a multiple target instant win spell against these particular types of enemies, making it all the more impressive to upcast. Taking the number 4 spot, we have Armor of Agathys. This is a 1st level abjuration spell. You cast on yourself and has a duration of 1 hour with no concentration needed. Once cast, you gain 5 temporary hit points, and any creature that hits you with a melee attack while you have any temporary hit points remaining takes 5 cold damage. Armor of Agathys is a spell only warlocks have access to normally, and because of that, it's uniquely designed to be very good for upcasting, as warlocks, by the nature of their pack magic spellcasting, only cast spells at their highest level spell slot. When you upcast Armor of Agathys, you double the effect for each spell slot expended, gaining another 5 temporary hit points and 5 cold damage. If you cast it with a 2nd level spell slot, you gain 10 temporary hit points and deal 10 damage to melee attackers who hit you. 3rd level grants 15 and 15, etc, etc. What makes Armor of Agathys even more effective as an upcast spell is even though it's doubling the damage and temporary hit points, it's actually achieving more than that. As you increase in temporary hit points, the chance a single melee attack will deplete all of them in one hit goes down significantly. So against a melee foe who goes to hit you multiple times, you might get far more than just double your value on the damage component. As an example, say you upcast this spell at 3rd level. Someone attacks you in melee and hits you for 10 damage. Well, you still have 5 temporary hit points left, and they take the full 15 cold damage. If they try to hit you again, they'll take another 15 cold damage thanks to remaining temporary hit points. As a pure damage spell, it won't compete with other 3rd level options like your typical Fireball or Lightning Bolt. But the duration means you can cast it preemptively, saving yourself actions during the fight itself, and those other damage spells don't give you a huge cushion of hit points on top of it. The way Armor of Agathys deals damage makes the value it gets for being upcast even greater than just doubling the overall effect, which is why it earns a high spot on this list. Coming in at number 3 in this list, we have Counterspell. Counterspell is a 3rd level abjuration spell. It has a range of 60 feet and takes 1 reaction to cast whenever you see a creature in range casting a spell, where it has the effect to interrupt the target of the process of casting that spell. If this spell is a 3rd level or lower, it automatically causes the spell to fail. If the target spell is 4th level or higher, you're required to make an ability check based on your spellcasting ability modifier, where the difficulty is 10 plus that spell's level. If you have the typical 16 in your spellcasting stat, that means attempting to counterspell a 4th level spell has about a 50% chance to succeed. Each level above that lowers your chances by 5%. But you can get around that by upcasting your counterspell. If your counterspell is upcast to 4th level, it will automatically work on 4th level spells like it does on 3rd level or lower spells. The same is true for every level you upcast it to, all the way up to the 9th level. Counterspell is one of the most powerful measures players have against spellcasting enemies. Spells usually have the highest potential for impact in a fight, and the higher the spell slot, the higher the impact. Add on the fact that you typically only use 1 spell per turn, even for enemies, means you are functionally trading your reaction for your enemy's most powerful action. And you're usually trading equal level spell slots when you upcast it, making the investment to spell slots even. Anytime your reaction can rob an enemy of its turn, it's super worthwhile. Even more so when it's robbing them of such a powerful action. Even without the upcasting, Counterspell is often worth it at 3rd level just for the chance of negating an enemy's spell. But upcasting Counterspell to ensure your Counterspell works is one of the most useful and important upcasting benefits in the game. Counterspell is probably the most frequently upcasted spell in the game, just because you know exactly what you're getting every time you upcast it. And it's pretty much always worth it to upcast Counterspell so it automatically works. It's not just a powerful function, it's a fundamental function of how Counterspell works, making it an easy addition to this list. Slotted in at number 2, we have Bless. Bless is a 1st level enchantment spell. It takes 1 action to cast, has a range of 30 feet, and has a duration of 1 minute with concentration. You can target up to 3 creatures with it, and for the rest of the duration, they gain a 1d4 bonus to all attacks and saving throw rolls. Despite its low level, Bless is one of the best buff spells in the game. There aren't a lot of easy ways to buff your team's chance to hit outside of giving advantage, and Bless is one of the best ways. This saving throw bonus is also incredible, and Bless is one of the few spells that actively helps you retain concentration on it by buffing that concentration saving throw. Bless does have one odd downside that often comes up, especially in very early levels. It only targets 3 allies. Your most common Dungeons & Dragons party is 4 members, so someone is usually getting left out. And that's where upcasting comes in. For every level you upcast Bless, you get to target 1 additional creature. So a 2nd level Bless will now encompass your poor 4th party member who was left out. And as you gain allies, such as animal companions, dungeon master controlled characters, or even the odd summoned creature your party can make, you can scale up Bless to meet those needs. Other upcasted spells often fully double their effects, either with extra targets or full numerical improvements, but it can't be ignored just how good Bless is as a buff spell on its own right. So ensuring you can include as many creatures as possible as you gain levels makes it a great spell to upcast. An interesting way to look at upcasting is if the upcasted version of a lower level spell is comparable to other spells at its new level. As an example, 3rd level spells are often considered a huge step up in power level for spellcasters in D&D. If Bless only existed as a 3rd level spell that now gains its benefits to 5 creatures, it would still be one of the best 3rd level spells in the game. So even if it might not be getting double its targets every level it's upcasted like other spells, the total effect you're getting is comparable or better, though some spells might give you more than double your targets. Finally, shambling into number 1 spot on this list, we have Animate Dead. Animate Dead is a 3rd level necromancy spell. It has a cast time of 1 minute, a range of 10 feet, and a permanent duration. Animate Dead is a grisly spell. At its base level, you target a pile of bones or corpse of humanoid in range. The spell animates the target, making a skeleton or zombie, depending on if it's bones or a corpse. You can control the undead with a bonus action so long as it's within 60 feet of you. The undead will follow any order until it's complete, otherwise they just stand still and defend themselves. The permanent duration means you can use multiple spell slots, creating multiple undead to control. The downside is, after 24 hours, the undead stop following commands unless you recast Animate Dead to reassert control. Now, Animate Dead is an interesting avenue for a summoning style build, as you can potentially create far more monsters than most conjure spells thanks to duration and do it well in advance of any fighting. But zombies and skeletons on their own aren't very threatening, making just casting 1 Animate Dead at 3rd level pretty underwhelming. You can usually get a lot more than a single zombie or skeleton with a 3rd level spell slot. But that's where upcasting comes in. With a lot of upcasting spells, you are doing well if it's doubling your spell's effect. Animate Dead does even better. With a 4th level spell slot, you can animate 2 additional undead, tripling the effect of a 3rd level Animate Dead. And you add an additional 2 undead for each spell slot that it's upcasted with. That's a pretty big swing in power, and this upcasting potential is what allows for wizards and clerics to animate an absurd number of undead, replacing the quality of a summon with sheer quantity. Creating 5 of any summon for 5th level spell is usually worth it. You can send those corpses into dungeons to trigger traps or take the brunt of an ambush thanks to the duration. You can just use them in a fight, as even though their attack stats are pretty underwhelming, a whole bunch of bodies throwing grapples or shoves at enemies to push them, keep them in place, or knock them prone can be pretty advantageous. Sheer numbers often means you'll be successful regardless of bad stats, or at least force your enemies to deal with them. With the power of upcasting on Animate Dead, assuming you've got a graveyard or other large gathering of corpses nearby, a max level Necromancer could put out 83 undead bodies with just their spell slots. And that's thanks to long duration and the 24 hours of control. You could even take a long rest and do it all over again. Those numbers become even more gaudy for Necromancer-focused wizards, as you get to raise more corpses and add your level to their hit points and your proficiency to their damage with the 6th level subclass ability Undead Thralls. This turns it from raising weak but long-lasting summons into a horde of incredibly dangerous summons. Summoning is always pretty high power in D&D, and if you're ever in need of an actual army of summons, then no other spell quite matches up to the upcasting of Animate Dead. There are a lot of powerful spells in D&D that have the potential to shape or break a campaign in various different ways. Some spells have really high damage output, while other spells might excel at fulfilling a certain niche or role your party might need to be filled. However, there are some spells that are considered so strong and exploitable that these spells tend to either get banned or reworked to make them feel more balanced. So in this video, we're going to go over some of the spells that are widely considered some of the most powerful spells you can obtain, whether it be due to ease of usage, or for how easy the spells to exploit and take advantage of, or just the general impact of a campaign overall. And firing this list up at number 10, we have our good friend Fireball. This is a 3rd level spell with a range of 150 feet, it casts time in 1 action, and can cover a huge radius of 20 feet in a sphere on a certain point, which deals 8d6 fire damage to everything inside of it, and set into flame anything flammable that isn't being worn or carried. And for a 3rd level spell, the damage Fireball can cause is unmatched by few spells until you get access to much higher level spells. The only real downside is that it deals fire damage, which a lot of enemies in the game can resist or outright be immune to, especially during later parts of the game. However, despite that fact, Fireball still remains relevant throughout the entirety of the campaign due to not only its high damage output, but also its ease of use and even easier targeting, since its radius is big enough to be able to engulf more than one enemy within its sphere, unless your targets are very spread out. And if you're an evocation wizard, you also don't ever have to worry about hitting any of your friends due to the Sculpt spell feature, allowing you to emit up to 4 creatures from the damage and blast radius when using the spell, making this spell even easier to manage and use. And for the amount of damage Fireball can do, 8d6 damage equates to an average of 28 damage total. To put this in perspective, the highest damaging 2nd level spell like Shatter or Rhyme's Binding Ice only deal 3d8 damage, or an average of 13 damage. And the next strongest 3rd level spell that isn't Lightning Bolt, which also has the same damage, is Tidal Wave, which deals 48 bludgeoning damage, or an average of 18 damage, but can also prone targets in the area. So already Fireball's damage is much higher than any other spell within its own level, and easily furthers the gaps between 3rd and 2nd level spells in terms of damage. And in terms of higher level spells, you won't find anything that deals more damage than simply upcasting Fireball using your desired spell slot until you gain access to the 7th level spells, where you can learn Delayed Fireball, which is technically only slightly stronger if you drop concentration on it immediately after your turn ends, since dropping concentration can be done at any time without using any of your actions. And while there are definitely stronger spells, such as Meteor Swarm, a 9th level spell which deals 46 total damage, split between 20d6 bludgeoning and fire damage, Fireball is readily available upon reaching 5th level as a full caster class such as Wizard or Sorcerer, meaning it gets to see more use as opposed to Meteor Swarm, which only becomes available at the back end of a campaign since 9th level spells are only obtainable at 17th level. However, the reason why Fireball only takes the 10th spot on this list is because, unlike most of the spells we're going to be going over, the only thing Fireball really does is force your DM to adjust future encounters to compensate for the sudden influx of power your party will be receiving as a result, which is not an uncommon thing to do over the course of the game anyway. It's just a more prominent spell for this to happen with, among others. And at number 9, we have Animate Objects. This is a 5th level concentration spell, which allows you to animate up to 10 tiny or small inanimate objects within 120 feet that are non-magical and not being worn or carried. However, the number of items you can animate varies depending on the size of the object. Medium objects count as 2 objects towards the 10 object limit, large objects count as 4, and huge count as 8. And each object has their own hit points, AC, damage values, as well as their own ability scores, with strength and dexterity varying between sizes. They all possess 30 feet of movement, which can also be flying speed if the object has no way of moving on its own, such as legs on a statue. However, what makes this spell a true contender for one of the most powerful spells in this list is definitely the amount of total damage it can deal against the creature. Much like how Firebolt can deal a tremendous amount of damage to multiple creatures, Animate Objects can do the same thing to a single creature. You see, tiny objects deal 1d4 plus 4 bludgeoning damage and has a plus 8 to hit. And if you manage to fit all 10 of these tiny objects within 5 feet of a creature, which is pretty easy if you're animating 10 silver coins, allowing them to fly, for instance, then you can have all of them attack the single creature for 10d4 plus 40 damage. To put this into perspective, a 5th level Firebolt will do an average of 35 fire damage to a single target, whereas Animate Objects used against one target is equal to an average of 65, with the minimum amount of damage doing being 50 if you only rolled once. Obviously, this does assume that your objects hit their target, so the damage can vary and change on a dime. But overall, Animate Objects and Firebolt both work really well together since they both allow you to reliably cover single target and multi-target options whenever needed, and deal enough damage that you don't really need anything else for the most part. And you can even use them together since commanding your objects only uses your bonus action. So you can also cast Fireball in subsequent turns after you use Animate Objects in order to maximize your damage in a single turn. However, be aware of the downsides of Animate Objects, which is their attacks are not considered magical, which means that anything that is resistant or immune to non-magical bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing damage can give you trouble. In which case you're better off using an alternative spell like Bigsby's Hand if you're looking for a spell that has good single target damage in the form of force damage, and a bit of utility since of being able to push or grapple opponents. Otherwise, the damage of this spell and how easy it is to use are more than enough to take on most encounters. As for why this spell takes number 9 on this list, well, it's mostly for the same reasons as Fireball. All it does is deal really high damage, which can force your DM to adjust certain encounters accordingly with these two spells in mind if they still want to give your party a challenge. But sometimes having high damage isn't all it takes to make a powerful spell, which can be proven by the next spell on this list. And at number 8, we have Banishment. This is a 4th level concentration spell that allows you to poof away a creature to a different plane of existence for up to 1 minute if they fail a charisma saving throw in order to resist the effect altogether. However, there are 2 different things that happen depending on whether or not the creature is native to your plane of existence. If it is, then it will simply put into a harmless demi-plane where it will stay in timeout for the combat until the spell ends, in which case it returns as if it were the nearest unoccupied space closest to where it would first banished. However, if that creature is not native to your plane of existence, then the creature is transported back to its home plane, with a faint popping noise to alert you of that fact, and will stay there if you manage to concentrate on the spell for the full minute. Otherwise, it will return to your plane of existence. This spell is excellent for taking out one creature from combat regardless of whether or not the creature is native to your plane. Or you can banish multiple creatures if you upcast it, since using a 5th level spell slot or higher allows you to target an additional creature for each slot above the 4th level, which can make many combat fights significantly easier. You also don't have to worry about the creature breaking out or returning to their own plane, since the spell also incapacitates them for the duration of the spell, meaning they can't use any actions or reactions during that time. The reason why this is so important is because it reduces the action economy available to your enemies. Action economy is basically an implicit resource mechanic of the game where the amount of actions your party can make in comparison to your enemies can drastically sway the course of an encounter. If there are only 4 of you and 6 enemies, then it's safe to assume that your enemies have a slight advantage due to having more action economy and things to do overall. Usually, the fastest way to get rid of action economy is to get rid of your enemies, whether it's by reducing their hit points to 0 or outright banishing a problematic enemy to the Shadow Realm temporarily. And if you manage to banish a particularly strong demon and manage to maintain your concentration for a full minute, then you have effectively eliminated the demon with only a single spell, which is not common to do. However, there are a couple of downsides of Banishment which keep it from being higher on this list, and that's mainly because it requires a charisma saving throw in order to pull it off. This isn't normally a problem at the time you're able to learn the spell, however, as the campaign progresses, a lot of creatures, namely fiends and celestials, tend to have much higher charisma scores and proficiencies which can hinder this spell a lot more in terms of usefulness. The other reason is because there's a spell that can basically accomplish what the spell does, but better, and can be obtained at a little earlier level, which we'll get into in time. And at number 7, we have Wall of Force. This is a 5th level concentration spell that allows you to create an impassable and invisible wall of force at a point of your choosing within 120 feet of you for up to 10 minutes. You can shape this wall by either creating a hemisphere or sphere with a radius of 10 feet, or you create a series of 10 by 10 panels for the purpose of creating boxes, ramps, bridges, or whatever other construct you wish, so long as the panels are touching one another. This spell is extremely useful because it allows passage to nothing and is immune to all damage. The wall can't even be dispelled through the use of Dispel magic. In fact, the only way you can actually get rid of the Wall of Force is by casting the spell Disintegrate on it, which is a 6th level spell. So only stronger creatures will be able to effectively counter it. What makes this spell so powerful though, is the fact that you can trap creatures inside of the wall with no easy way for them to get out. In fact, they wouldn't even be able to use spells or abilities that allow them to travel through the ethereal plane, such as Blink, a 3rd level spell which specifically allows you to travel in and out of the ethereal plane, and can allow for the caster to more easily escape a hostile environment in this case, since Wall of Force also blocks ethereal travel through it. The spell can sort of work like a light version of Force Cage, a 7th level spell which is specifically designed to entrap things within it, as well as preventing most types of teleportation from functioning while inside of it, unless they successfully pass a charisma saving throw. However, Wall of Force has the added flexibility of being shaped into extra terrain that can be manipulated in ways to reach new areas, since nothing can pass through it and nothing says you can't walk out the wall either if it's laid horizontally or diagonally in an upwards direction. You can also use this spell to protect your party temporarily against outside hazards, such as sandstorms or falling debris, or as a way to trap a creature inside a toxic or hazardous environment. Do keep in mind, however, that the invisible wall does count as full cover for the purposes of spells that require you to see the target, so to speak. This basically means that for spells like Vicious Mockery, which require you to target a creature you can see, wouldn't be able to affect a creature that's on the other side of the Wall of Force, despite the fact that it technically is a sound-based spell. There are a few sage advice posts from Jeremy Crawford, one of the developers of D&D 5e, where he clarifies this. On one of them, he states in response to a question asked about whether or not Hold Person can be used from the other side of a Wall of Force, that with this spell, you can't target a creature behind total cover unless the spell says otherwise, followed by the page number of the PHB where, under the A Clear Path to the Target section, it states, to target something, you must first have a clear path to it, so it can't be behind total cover. This can be a bit confusing as there are technically some spells that can still pass through the Wall of Force, namely teleportation spells. A quick example would be the 2nd level spell Misty Step, which teleports you up to 30 feet to an unoccupied space that you can see. But the reason why Misty Step would still work in this instance is because it has a range of self, rather than an actual range which targets an area. So if you're trapped inside a Wall of Force, you would still be able to just Misty Step without any problems because you're not targeting anything outside of it, only yourself, allowing you to successfully break out of your imprisonment. There's also another spell that you can use if you're looking for an offensive option to attack something on the other side of the wall. The 4th level spell, Rothathim's Psychic Lance, has an alternative way of targeting creatures by allowing you to utter the creature's name, forcing the creature to become the target so long as they're within 120 feet range of the spell, even if you can't see it. Overall, Wall of Force is an amazing spell both in combat and out, which is why it deserves a spot on this list at number 7. And at number 6, we have Leomund's Tiny Hut. This is a 3rd level spell which creates a 10-foot radius dome of force that can house up to 9 creatures of medium size or smaller and lasts for 8 hours. It normally takes 1 minute to cast, but because it also has the ritual tag, some spellcasters can spend 11 minutes to ritual cast instead of using a spell slot. This dome protects any creatures that are inside the dome at the time of casting from pretty much any outside effects, such as projectiles or spells or magical effects. However, the hut also comes with a dry and comfy environment, allowing your party to take refuge in harsh deserts or snowy mountains, where finding proper shelter might be tough to come by. Creatures also can't pass into the dome from outside unless they were a creature that was already inside the dome when the spell's first cast. The intended use of the spell is to provide your party with a place to take long rests whenever you want, since the spell lasts for 8 hours and doesn't require concentration. So if you or your party are heads deep inside a dungeon or far from civilization, then Leomund's Tiny Hut is a fantastic way to rest up, especially since ritual casting it wouldn't eat up a spell slot, so a wizard wouldn't need to save a spell slot if they wanted to have a safety net in case you and your party aren't able to seek proper refuge. However, what makes the spell particularly powerful is the way it's worded. You see, objects and creatures can't pass through the dome from outside. However, if your party is inside the dome by the time the hut goes up, then objects they use can pass through the dome and move freely through it. This means that if you have anyone with a long-range weaponry, such as a bow and arrow, then they can effectively shoot at anything outside the hut, which is transparent from the inside of it. And while spells and magical effects normally can't pass through the dome no matter what, there is nothing stopping one of your spellcasters from leaving the dome, casting a fireball, and then retreating back into the safety of the dome on their turn. The only caveat is that the caster of the tiny hut can't leave the dome, since this is one of the criteria for ending the spell early. And since the tiny hut is opaque from the outside, it can make it difficult for enemies to know where you're coming from if someone decides to exit the bubble and he has a powerful spell. However, there are ways around this if the enemy has a ranged weaponry, and that's for them to ready their actions to shoot at anything that decides to come out of the hut. But even then, your ranged attackers can still pick them off from within the hut if need be. Really, the only reliable way to work around Leomund's tiny hut is by casting Dispel Magic on it, which would instantly end the spell early, exposing your party at inopportune times. But the fact that, if you can find proper setup time to erect the hut in the first place, you can effectively create an impenetrable fortress that you can use against enemies until they either retreat or give up, or find some other way around it, is the reason why the spell takes the number 6 spot on this list. It basically allows you to do what Wall of Force can't, which is attack things from the other side of an impenetrable barrier, while you and your party remain safely tucked away inside. What's more is that using this spell in this way is technically way outside what the initial intention of the spell is supposed to be, which is a way of allowing your party to take long rests in environments where long rests may not be possible. And at number 5, we have Hypnotic Pattern. This is a 3rd level concentration spell which can charm, incapacitate, and reduce the movement speed of a creature to 0 in a 30-foot cube within 120 feet of you if they fail a wisdom saving throw in order to shrug off the effects. This is an amazingly powerful spell for a number of reasons. Firstly, the creature becomes charmed, which means they can't make any attacks against the one who charmed them in the first place, and grants the charmer advantage on ability checks that involve social interactions with the creature. Secondly, the creature is also incapacitated, meaning that it can't take any actions or reactions on its turn. The third reason why Hypnotic Pattern is so strong is that it also reduces a movement's creature speed to 0, so they can't get away or chase you if your party decides you're better off not engaging in that particular fight. And lastly, unlike other spells, such as Slow, which requires affected creatures to repeat their saving throw at the end of each of their turns until either the effect wears off or until they succeed, once Hypnotic Pattern succeeds, there are no further saving throws required in order to keep the effect going. In fact, the only way to break out Hypnotic Pattern is to have another creature use their action to shake you out of your stupor, or be damaged in any way, whether it be accidental or intentional, or break the concentration of the caster who used the spell in the first place. This is important to note because it means that if you happen to hit every enemy in an encounter with it, then you can just end the fight right then and there. And even if you only hit a half of your enemies, or even 1 or 2, you still remove those targets from the encounter and no longer have to worry about them unless one of the enemies wastes their entire action in order to make their friend snap back to reality. Which can be risky since action economy is too important to waste, especially when combats in 5e typically take no more than a few turns. And while Banishment can sometimes be a better option depending on the creature in question, and the fact that there are even fewer ways to break out of being banished, Hypnotic Pattern excels at being much more generic and widely useful, due to being able to target wisdom saving throws, which are a bit more evenly spread amongst creatures overall. So in terms of non-damaging spells, it's really hard to beat Hypnotic Pattern, considering it's only a 3rd level spell, which makes it available relatively early compared to other powerful spells in this list, making Hypnotic Pattern an absolutely fantastic spell to add to your arsenal. However, this does mean that it competes with other fantastic spells like Fireball, Slow, Lightning Bolt, and even Counterspell, which are all great spells for both damage and utility standpoints. But even then, Hypnotic Pattern's ability to instantly shrink the size of encounters, and thus reducing the action economy your enemies have, is definitely worth sacrificing the ability to learn any of these other 3rd level spells, minus maybe Fireball of course, which is why Hypnotic Pattern deserves to be so high on this list. And at number 4, we have Polymorph. This is a 4th level concentration spell which can last for up to 1 hour and lets you transform one creature you can see within 60 feet into any beast, so long as the beast's challenge rating is equal to or less than that target's level or CR. And if the creature is unwilling, they have to succeed in making a wisdom saving throw against it in order to avert the effects altogether. While transformed, they retain their alignment and personality, but must use the stats and mental ability scores of the beast that they've been transformed into, only turning back once the spell expires or their hit points reach 0. The simplest and most straightforward use of Polymorph is turning a creature into something harmless, like a frog or a cat, where they won't be able to deal much damage or be forced to try and run away. This can be very useful for temporarily getting rid of a particular threat that might be giving your party trouble. However, the more fun way to use Polymorph is to simply transform one of your party members into a particularly powerful beast, such as a giant ape or a Tyrannosaurus Rex, both of which sport some very strong stats for the level you're allowed to transform into. Let's take the T-Rex for example. It's a huge creature with a challenge rating of 8 and a whopping total of 136 hit points, and makes 2 attacks in a single turn, provided the attacks are made against different targets. And both attacks the Rex have are pretty strong as well, with the bite dealing 4d12 plus 7 piercing damage and grapples and restrains your opponent instantly with a relatively high DC threshold of 17 in order to escape from it. Meanwhile, its tail deals slightly less damage overall at 3d8 plus 7, but still very respectable compared to what most classes can do at 8th level. And that's not even counting its 50-foot movement speed, which can cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time, giving you free reign to chase down most enemies that might feel too intimidated to fight. And while the T-Rex only has a relatively low AC at 13, it does make up for it by having an insane amount of hit points that it can take before your party members will be forced to change back into their normal form. But that's honestly why Polymorph is considered so strong. As long as you have the spell slots that you can cast in it, Polymorph basically gives your party member an entirely new health bar each time you use it. So even if your party member reverts back, you can just keep refreshing the spell over and over again until the battle is over. Of course, there is the main drawback of now labeling yourself as a big threat on the field, which might force enemies to try and knock you out of the concentration to maintain the spell. But that also assumes that they can get past the T-Rex that may or may not be blocking the way to you. And the spell only gets stronger if you're a sorcerer using the Twin Spell meta magic, a feature that allows you to spend sorcery points in order to cast a spell which targets a single creature onto another additional creature, allowing you to have 2 Rexes for the price of 1 4th level spell slot. And unlike spells such as Firebolt and Hypnotic Pattern, 2 spells that could tip the balance of encounters but don't outright change the nature of the game, Polymorph is one of those spells that can very easily topple the game's balance to the point where your DM may start considering making future encounters with Polymorph in mind specifically, which is why this spell ranks so high in this list at number 4. And at number 3, we have Conjure Woodland Beans. This is another 4th level concentration spell, which works the same as a 3rd level spell, Conjure Animals, except it's specifically for summoning fey creatures. You can summon 1 fey creature that is of challenge rating 2 or lower, 2 fey creatures of CR 1 or lower, 4 of challenge rating 1/2 or lower, or 8 fey creatures of CR 1/4 or lower. Once summoned, you roll initiative for the creatures as a group, rather than sharing your own initiative, and will follow any verbal commands you give them to the best of the abilities, but doesn't use any actions on your part to do so. Now, do you remember how chaotic being able to cast Polymorph can be? Well, imagine if you can cast Polymorph up to 8 times in a single turn, because that is one of the things you can do with this spell if you end up conjuring 8 pixies. Each pixie has 1 hit point and an AC of 15, so they're fairly easy to put down. But if they aren't, they each have a single casting of various spells they can cast per day, with one of them being Polymorph. They also can concentrate on an ability called Superior Invisibility, allowing them to turn invisible until they end their concentration, which can also be very useful for them in case they want to cast other spells such as Dispel Magic or even Sleep. Basically, if your party consists of 4 people, then you can essentially have 4 of the pixies cast Polymorph on all 4 of you, transforming everyone into T-Rexes, while the other 4 use Superior Invisibility and spread out to avoid any AoE damage as they wait for an opportunity to recast it when needed. Alternatively, each pixie also has access to the Fly spell, which can create a scenario where your party can become flying T-Rexes soaring in the skies. Whatever the case, this spell is extremely powerful because of Polymorph and nothing else, as everything else that you can summon isn't nearly as broken or overpowered. However, it is very important to note that this might not be possible in some games, depending on how your DM runs the spells that let you summon creatures. While the intended way to run them is to let your DM choose what creatures are summoned, there are other DMs that will allow the caster to pick and choose, since it can take less time, since the caster will usually know what they want to summon already in the first place. But if your DM is the kind that allows you to choose what you want to summon and already knows about the pixie shenanigans, then it's often safe to assume that the option to summon pixies would be banned. So while Polymorph is the main reason why Conjure Woodland Beans can be immensely powerful, the reason why Conjure Woodland Beans takes the higher spot on this list is because it is the first spell on this list to actually have a banned option as a result of how powerful it is. And for very good reason, despite how fragile and weak the pixies themselves are. It is one of those spells that is usually worth it just for the Polymorph cheese that comes with it. And at number 2, we have Simulacrum. This is a 7th level spell that basically creates an illusory duplicate of a beast or humanoid that is within touch range for the entire duration of the spell. This spell takes 12 hours to cast and requires 1,500 gold pieces worth of powdered ruby, which the spell consumes. And while fairly expensive to cast, the duplicate does last until it's dispelled, either by having its hit points reduced to 0, cast Dispel again, or dispelled by other means such as the use of Dispel Magic. The Simulacrum assumes all of the stats and abilities of the creature duplicating, barring its hit points, which are half of the original creature's, and is considered a construct rather than a beast or humanoid. The Simulacrum is friendly to you and any creatures you designate, obeys your commands, and acts on your turn in combat. However, with the downside that it cannot grow to become more powerful, and cannot restore any expended spell slots or increase its level. And while you could make another Simulacrum at a later level to keep up with the strength of your party, the fact that it basically costs 1,500 gold to do so might make it a bit tough depending on the campaign and how easy money is to obtain. That also doesn't include any repairs you make to the Simulacrum, which cost 100 gold worth of rare herbs and minerals per hit point in order to maintain, since most spells that heal don't affect constructs, which the Simulacrum is classified as. However, what the Simulacrum lacks in survivability is made up for by the fact that it's an additional body on the board that shares the same abilities as the creatures you duplicate. So if you made a duplicate of your fighter who has also taken some levels in Barbarian, for example, then your duplicate would also be capable of using Rage, extra attacks, and Action Surge with no problems at all, which would result in a lot more damage being thrown out. And if your Simulacrum goes down, then the duplicate still has done its job of diverting damage away from your other party members. Alternatively, you could duplicate a spellcaster, such as yourself, and have the duplicates cast utility spells while you focus on damaging spells or vice versa. Or you can double up on either since you both go on the same turn as each other. Being able to create a secondary version of any one member of your party is a huge power increase simply because you're effectively doubling down what party members can do. What's worse than enemies facing a party with a Gloomstalker Ranger that has a Sharpshooter feat? Having to face 2 Gloomstalker Rangers with a Sharpshooter feat, of course. And having a Simulacrum that's a Rage at the same time as a Bear Totem Warrior Barbarian duplicate will add a whole bunch of pressure to your enemies, since they'll be forced to split their attention and have trouble dealing reliable damage, since the Totem Warrior Barbarians that have taken the Bear aspect resist every damage type in the game, barring Psychic. While Simulacrum is indeed a powerful spell on its own, the main reason why this spell in particular takes number 2 spot is because it can be made even stronger through the use of another spell called Wish. Basically, at 17th level, you can make a Simulacrum of yourself, take a long rest to restore your spell slots, have that Simulacrum cast a Wish in order to cast Simulacrum on you without any material components. The new Simulacrum will then be able to cast both Simulacrum and Wish, so you basically repeat the process until you've amassed a massive army of illusionary clones of yourself. And if you're worried about money or costs, you can have one of the duplicates cast a Wish for the necessary components. While this is all technically rules as written, this isn't something that's always allowed, or often comes with very heavy restrictions. For much of the same reasons choosing 8 pixies for Conjure Woodland Beans isn't allowed. It's just too powerful and can very easily toss the game's balance out the window. In fact, the Adventures League, an official organized play system run by Wizards of the Coast, have actually nerfed this combo for balancing purposes. The short version is that Simulacrums aren't allowed to cast the spell Simulacrum or any other spell that duplicates its effects. And if Simulacrum casts a Wish in order to wish for something outside of what's listed in the description for Wish, then the consequences and risk of never being able to cast Wish again also apply to you instead of just your Simulacrum, and extends to any future Simulacrums you create. While these rules aren't 100% official outside of AL, it does demonstrate just how strong this combination is, considering it forced a new ruling for it. However, even outside of the Wish cheese, Simulacrum stands on its own as a very useful and powerful spell. As for the enabler of the Simulacrum cheese, and at number 1, we have Wish, a 9th level spell that can basically grant you any wish you want, with your DM being the one to decide how the wish turns out. And while you can freely duplicate a spell of 8th level or lower using Wish without any consequences, anything outside of that incurs penalties as a result due to the stress of casting such a powerful spell. Firstly, every time you cast a spell, you take 1d10 necrotic damage per level of that spell that can't be mitigated in any way. Your strength also drops to 3 for 2d4 days, which can be reduced by spending the next few days resting and not exerting yourself. But the most important thing to note is that there is a 33% chance that you just lose the ability to ever cast Wish again. However, all of these effects are very inconsequential when you consider just how far you can go with Wish. You can rewrite a piece of history, become unkillable, or destroy your enemies instantaneously. You might bring important NPCs back to life or restore lost civilizations, or simply become the richest person in existence. Maybe you choose to become the ruler of the Abyssal Plains, or control an entire army of undead even. There are just so many possibilities with Wish that only having a 33% chance to never cast Wish again, and needing a couple of days of rest afterwards, seems way too nice of a penalty. However, in the end, your DM does have the final say in regards to how your wish plays out. But a lot of the time, DMs might incorporate a monkey's paw effect to a wish that is made outside of the listed examples in the spell's description that might give you a pause for the next wish you might make. Wish is just one of those spells where you really need to work together in order to make something work in a way that is satisfying and pleasing to everyone involved, since changing certain events in history may impact other players in your party or outright force your DM to make changes to the campaign accordingly. While this can be fun and interesting, it can also be stressful if not handled well. Sometimes it might not even be worth dealing with in the first place, so some DMs might outright ban Wish from campaigns to begin with. As for why this spell takes its house on this list, well, it's because Wish really is as powerful as it seems. There are no special gimmicks about this spell, and even the safe spells that can't get monkey pawed are still plenty useful. Being able to create a non-magical object that's worth 25,000 gold pieces is not terrible, especially if you can find a way to sell whatever it is you create. Fully healing your entire party and cleansing their debuffs is also really good, especially as a last resort sort of deal in tough situations. Granting resistance to a damage type forever for up to 10 creatures is frighteningly strong, especially if you can find a way to gain easy resistance to every damage type in the game, which isn't hard if you're allowed to cheese with Simulacrums. You can also grant immunity to a specific spell or magical effect for 8 hours, or you can just undo basically anything that's happened within the last round of combat, which in itself can mean forcing a reroll, undoing a saving throw by an enemy, etc, etc. There are just so many things you can do with this spell that it's no wonder why it's usually considered the strongest and most broken spell in the game. There are a ton of spells in D&D 5e that have the potential to deal fire damage to your opponents, 35 to be exact. So in today's video, we're going to go over some of the best fire damage spells that you might consider taking, even if it is the third worst damage type to deal, since a lot of monsters are resistant or immune to its type of damage. And starting us off at number 10, we have Firebolt. This is a powerful cantrip that deals 1d10 fire damage to a creature or object you hit within range at 120 feet, scaling up to 2d10 at level 5, 3d10 at level 11, and 4d10 at level 17. Now, having access to a cantrip that deals like d10 in damage is extremely valuable because it means you will always have a way to deal reliable damage on the off chance you're left in a situation with no spell slots. Or maybe you're a fighter who's taken the magic initiate feat in order to just have a reliable range option without needing to carry around a ranged weapon, like a bow or crossbow. And since this cantrip requires you to make a ranged spell attack against the target's AC, it's usually paired with something like Toll the Dead, which targets a creature's wisdom save and provides you more way of attacking your enemies. You can also ignite flammable objects that aren't being worn or carried with this spell, such as torches, candles, oils, or pieces of wood or cloth, which can all have niche uses as well. Firebolt is a must-have spell for a lot of players because it sports decent enough damage to not feel underwhelming at higher levels, while also being free to cast since it's a cantrip. However, if dealing fire damage is your primary objective, then there are a lot of spells that do this job a lot better. This isn't a cantrip you want to rely on, rather it's one you'll want to use whenever you might need to conserve resources while outputting a decent amount of damage, which is why this spell only takes number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Flame Strike. This is a 5th level cleric spell which deals 4d6 in fire and radiant damage for a total of 86 damage, to everything inside its 10-foot radius, 40-foot high cylinder unless they successfully make a dexterity saving throw in order to have the damage. And with a range of 60 feet, this gives cleric players some much wanted range and damage that they might otherwise struggle to achieve. It's also capable of hitting flying targets that are up to 40 feet in the air, making this a decent catch-all option when dealing with both ground and air threats at once. And dealing radiant damage as part of the spell works heavily in the spell's favor, since even if creatures resist the fire damage from the spell, most creatures only resist one damage type or the other. Unfortunately, because the spell is only available to clerics, outside of a few specific subclasses, its uses are kind of limited in terms of who can use the spell. Fortunately, however, this problem is mostly remedied due to the existence of Fireball. A spell that is 2 levels lower than Flame Strike, sports the same total damage as pure fire damage instead of part radiant damage, has a bigger range and radius than Flame Strike, and is more widely available to different classes. This spell is basically a way to provide a decent damaging option to what's widely considered a support type class, which is why Flame Strike is learned a lot later than something like Fireball, and why this spell only takes its number 9 spot on this list. And at number 8, we have Delayed Blast Fireball. This is a 7th level concentration spell that has the same range and stats as Fireball, upcasted to 7th level, dealing 12d6 fire damage by default, but with a few key differences. The first difference is that this spell requires concentration in order to maintain its effect of, as you may have guessed, delaying the blast of the fireball by condensing the spell into a bead-like form that detonates whenever you lose or decide to drop concentration on it. The second difference is, while in this state, the damage of the spell is increased by 1d6 fire damage to the end of each of your turns over the course of 1 minute, bringing its total base damage to 22d6 damage if detonated after the full duration. A creature can also pick up the bead by successfully making a dexterity saving throw and throwing it up to 40 feet away. However, if the creature fails their dexterity saving throw, the spell immediately ends and erupts, triggering its normal effect. One common way you might use this spell would be in conjunction with the 9th level spell, Time Stop, which gives you 1d4 plus 1 turns in a row, allowing you to take actions and make movement as normal. The main restriction to Time Stop is that it ends if you use any effect that affects another creature other than yourself, or affects an object being worn or carried by anyone other than yourself, though it also ends if you move more than 1,000 feet away from the location where you cast the spell. So what this combo does is, it basically allows you to add 5d6 extra damage, depending on the roll for Time Stop, to your Delayed Blast Fireball, because the Fireball doesn't affect creatures whenever you cast it, only whenever you drop or lose concentration on it. Of course, you are using your 9th level spell slot in conjunction with this spell, which might not be the most efficient way to use your resources, especially since you might get unlucky and just roll a total of 2 turns with Time Stop, in which case you would be better just upcasting Delayed Blast Fireball to 9th level since it would have done the same amount of damage anyway. Another niche way of using this spell is by combining it with the sorcerer's meta magic option, Extended Spell, which lets you spend a sorcery point in order to double the duration of a spell you cast that has a duration of at least 1 minute, up to a duration of 24 hours. Since Delayed Blast Fireball's damage technically has no limit for how much it can take up, doubling its duration basically increases the potential ceiling of the spell to 32d6 fire damage, up from 22d6. It might be harder to pull off, but if you suspect that you might be able to squeeze out more of the spell beyond 1 minute, or want to give yourself a bigger grace period, then you could probably find some use for this. And since the bead that's created can technically be picked up and thrown, you can have the fireball's damage build up over a few rounds. Then let your highest dexterity party member attempt to pick it up, then throw it at a group of enemies waiting to ambush you in another room. The obvious risk of this, however, is the fact that if they fail their dexterity saving throw, the bead blows up in your party's faces and you'll end up in a bad situation. For this reason, perhaps consider allowing the rogue with the evasion feature attempt this while the party remains at a safe distance, as evasion allows the rogue to only take half damage on a failed dexterity saving throw against spells and no damage on a successful one, giving them the highest chance to not be blown up instantly if things don't go your way. Also, because of the way concentration works in this game, you can cast a spell, wait until whoever's turn is next in the initiative order, then drop concentration as a free action in order to detonate the fireball for 13d6 damage, which is 1d6 more than a regular fireball upcasted to 7th level. So technically, this spell does more damage than fireball if used in this way. And since dropping concentration is a free action, you'll still be able to use your reaction for whatever you may need it for. The main reason this spell only makes number 8 on this list, however, is mainly because you learned this spell a bit late, level 13 to be exact. And at the end of the day, this spell is basically just Fireball with a few niche ways to use it that don't really make or break the spell in any way. And being a 7th level spell that uses your concentration, there are plenty of better options you can use your concentration for, such as Reverse Gravity or Draconic Transformation. And if you just wanted to do damage with no gimmicks attached to it, you're probably better off upcasting Fireball, since chances are you'll already know the spell in the first place. So unless you're planning on making some use out of the other effects of Delayed Blast Fireball, you're probably better off opting for something with more utility instead, since the damage component is already covered with a normal Fireball. And at number 7, we have Flaming Sphere. This is a 2nd level concentration spell that allows you to conjure a 5-foot diameter sphere of fire for up to 1 minute. As a bonus action, you can move the sphere up to 30 feet and ram it into creatures for 2d6 fire damage, or half on a successful dexterity saving throw. Creatures that end their turn within 5 feet of the sphere must also make a dex save against the same damage, making this spell a great crowd control option against creatures you generally don't want occupying certain spaces on the field. You can also move the sphere over barriers up to 5 feet tall and jump it across pits up to 10 feet wide, which grants the sphere a decent amount of mobility as well. You can also use this spell as a light source, as it sheds bright light in a 20-foot radius and dim light for additional 20 feet. Being able to have early access to area denial spells can really help make or break encounters, because they can force enemies to move to unfavorable positions unless they wanted to take fire damage. Flaming Sphere accomplishes this very well, not just because it deals damage to creatures that end their turn within 5 feet of it, but because you can use your bonus action to ram it into a creature in order to force it to take damage, making them more inclined to move away from the sphere's radius. And if you were to position the sphere anywhere within 10 feet of you and use your terrain to your advantage in order to make yourself harder to get to, while also having your allies cover openings where enemies might slip through safely, this severely limits the options enemies will have if they want to reach you, since they would be more than likely to take opportunity attacks from your allies or be forced to stop within 5 feet of the sphere in order to attack you. Since many creatures probably don't want to risk dealing with those types of odds, this spell may, more often than not, work as a deterrent against unwanted creatures trying to go to the backline. But if you want to use the sphere in a more offensive manner, you can move the sphere around the battlefield instead, forcing creatures out of cover as you slowly urge them towards your party members or away from favorable positions. But what makes this spell truly unique over the other spells which do similar things, like Moonbeam, is that, unlike Moonbeam, it only requires your bonus action to move around the battlefield, whereas Moonbeam requires you to use your main action. This is important because spellcasters don't always have their bonus action available, so having a spell that uses your bonus action to move around and deal damage makes it far less committal, since it allows for the caster to use other non-concentration spells in conjunction with Flaming Sphere, which is why this spell takes number 7 spot on this list. And at number 6, we have Wall of Fire. This is a 4th level concentration spell that can create a wall of fire within a range of 120 feet, whose dimensions are 20 feet high, 60 feet long, and 1 foot thick. Alternatively, you can make a ringed wall whose dimensions are 20 feet high, 1 foot thick, and 20 feet in diameter, making this spell pretty flexible in how you're able to use it. Moreover, when the wall appears, creatures within its area take 5d8 fire damage, or half as much on a successful dex save, which is a decent amount of upfront damage for a 4th level spell. In addition to that, you can select which side of the wall is safe and which will deal an extra 5d8 fire damage to creatures that end their turn within 10 feet of it. Creatures passing through the wall or ending its turn inside the wall must also take 5d8 fire damage. The damage of this spell is pretty decent. It's not terrible, nor is it the best you're going to get out of a 4th level spell. However, what it lacks for in power is made up for in its utility and versatility as a crowd control spell. While Flaming Sphere can be used to urge creatures in a particular direction or block off small sections of a map, Wall of Fire can basically cut the entire map in half, or protect your party on all sides if you shape it like a ring. Forcing your enemy to split up and section off key units or take considerable damage can be very powerful at times, especially if you find yourself in a tough encounter with multiple creatures. And with a height of 20 feet, ranged creatures won't be able to fire or cast spells that rely on sight onto your party, since the wall is opaque and obscures sight. Meanwhile, melee units that have been split from the party must now make their way around the wall or take the damage going through it, since even though they only take half damage in success, it still guarantees at least some damage on the board. Another way you can use the spell is by simply surrounding a group of enemies with a ring option, forcing them to stay within the fire or move through it. And since the wall lets you make the ring up to 20 feet in diameter, there's nothing stopping you from making the wall smaller and making the outside of the wall be the safe side, burning enemies inside it to a cinder unless they move out of it. The reason this spell is number 6 on this list is because it's a little bit more situational than the other spells on the list. Some encounters might not have enough enemies spread out enough to really make full use of the spell, and if you're looking to restrict the movements or displace enemies, there are much better spells that do the same thing. Spells like Entangle and Web are both very good for keeping multiple creatures restrained inside a 20-foot area, while allowing your party to fire at them from afar if needed, since being restrained means that your enemies will have disadvantage with their attack rolls, while your party gets to make their own attacks against the restrained creatures with advantage. Spike Growth is another fantastic option, as the area within a 20-foot radius counts as difficult terrain, effectively halving a creature's movement while inside of it, while also punishing them for moving within it, taking 2d4 piercing damage for every 5 feet they travel. So, similarly to Delayed Fireball, you might end up having spells available that work better and in more situations overall, which might reduce how often you would want to use Wall of Fire, since it would be easier to gain more value out of other crowd control spells instead. However, Wall of Fire does have the benefit of dealing both upfront damage, while also having the utility and versatility being able to manipulate the battlefield more in your favor, which still makes the spell worth considering regardless. And at number 5, we have Scorching Ray. This second level spell lets you create 3 rays of fire that you hurl at creatures within a range of 120 feet. You can either choose to target one creature or several, but in either case you make an attack roll for each ray, dealing 2d6 fire damage per ray for a grand total of 66 fire damage. For a second level spell, this deals really good damage. A total of 66 damage is enough to deal a significant chunk of damage against lower CR creatures, which is when you usually first learn this spell. And having 3 chances to hit is also a plus because it helps guarantee that at least some damage will occur when casting the spell, unless you get really unlucky. And while having the option to have the rays target different creatures, it's not that much of a benefit since you usually just want to focus down one creature at a time, unless the particular creature looks weak enough that it might go down with 1 or 2 rays. It's also worth noting that the damage scales really well in this spell, since it doesn't just gain a single hit die of damage that most spells do when they're upcast at higher levels. Instead, you fire an additional ray, which technically means that you can potentially deal an extra 2d6 fire damage per level upcasted beyond 2nd level. Since this is one of the few spells in the game that lets you roll multiple attacks for individual damage, it makes a good spell to combine with spells like Hex or Spirit Shrouds, since they both add an additional 1d6 or 1d8 necrotic damage respectively to any attack rolls made. This means that if you manage to hit with all 3 rays and the creature attacking is affected with Hex, you would deal an extra 3d6 necrotic damage alongside 66 fire damage for a total of 9d6 damage. Unfortunately, in order to use Hex with Scorching Ray, you kind of need to jump through a couple of hoops since the spell is only available in the Wizard and Sorcerer spell list. However, Genie and Fiend Warlocks can learn Scorching Ray, while Aberrant Mind Sorcerers can learn Hex. There's also the Magic Initiate and Fey Touch feats which also allow you to learn Hex, so it's not the worst thing in the world to do, but probably not worth it depending on what you're looking for. While not as important, it's worth noting that Scorching Ray cannot be used with Twin Spell, the meta magic feature which allows sorcerers to cast a single target spell more than once against a target within range that's different from the first. This is because Scorching Ray has the potential to deal damage to more than one target, while Twin Spell specifically requires a spell that's only capable of targeting a single creature. The reason Scorching Ray takes number 5 spot on this list is because it's a second level spell that has a surprising amount of flexibility options with certain subclass features, most notably Warlock, that can make its damage go from good to great, but that's all it really does. And if we're looking at spells that only do damage, there are plenty more spells that deal fire damage better than Scorching Ray can. And at number 5, we have Firestorm. This is a 7th level spell that conjures up a fiery storm at a point you choose within range of 150 feet. In that area you choose, you create up to 10 10-foot cubes and arrange them however you wish. The only caveat is that each cube you make must touch an adjacent face of another cube. Creatures inside this area take 7d10 fire damage if they fail a dexterity saving throw, or half on a success. Basically, what this spell does is manipulate the area of effect the storm creates, shaping it into whatever form you need to hit creatures with it. And with each cube being 10 feet on all sides, this gives you a total of up to 400 foot of area coverage that you can have with the spell, if we also account for verticality. And the spell allows you to arrange the cubes however you want, so that you can make some pretty silly ways of covering large areas. For example, if your party members are surrounded by a large number of creatures, you can cast Firestorm and arrange the cubes in such a way that the storm engulfs only the enemies surrounding them, and then you might also extend it towards other enemies in the back, the archer on the roof, or whatever other targets might suit your fancy. A small thing, but one that's worth mentioning, is that because the cubes are required to touch, and the fact the spell specifically says the storm appears in a location you choose, this means you cannot have 2 separate firestorms happening at different parts of the map. You choose a location for the storm to take place and start connecting cubes around the space, ensuring that they all connect. The easiest way to put it would be, instead of Fireball exploding in a 20-foot radius sphere at a point you choose, perhaps you were, instead, able to manipulate the sphere in order to shape it to a much more favorable shape that could catch more enemies inside of it. This is effectively what you're doing with Firestorm. You create one area of effect, however big, tall, or as long as it needed to be. And while not as strong as Fireball upcasted to the same level, its utility and potential to shape the area of effect is honestly really good. But what keeps the spell from being any higher on this list is the fact that it's a 7th level spell, with no other utility other than its potential large area coverage. And because it doesn't persist like Wall of Fire does, you can't really use this as a form of area denial. You only really use the spell if you know you can hit more enemies with it than Fireball, since Fireball upcast at 7th level does more damage. Not to mention, Delayed Blast Fireball is also available at 7th level, along with a plethora of spells that are just more useful to take up most of the time. And at number 3, we have Heat Metal. This is a 2nd level concentration spell which allows you to choose a manufactured metal object and cause it to burn incredibly hot. A creature in contact with the heated object, a sword or piece of armor for example, takes 2d8 fire damage the first time you cast the spell. After that, you can use your bonus action on each of your turns after it in order to inflict the same damage again. Furthermore, if the creature is holding or wearing the object and takes damage from it, it makes a Constitution saving throw and trying to hold on to that object, if it can at all. However, even if a creature succeeds their Constitution saving throw in order to hold on to the object, they still suffer disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks until the start of your next turn. While not useful in every situation, the fact that this deals guaranteed damage with no way to reduce it is a phenomenal effect for a 2nd level spell. And unlike other spells where you can repeat saving throws in order to end the spell's effect, there's no such way for creatures to do that with this spell. Heat Metal lasts for the full duration or until the caster drops concentration for whatever reason, either through choice or through failing a concentration check. And a creature wearing metal armor is especially screwed by the effect, since it takes them at least 1 minute to take off medium armor. This means that a creature will take an unavoidable 20d8 fire damage over the course of 1 minute, unless they don't find a way to stop the caster from concentration on the spell, or use other resources and to try to mitigate the damage in some way. And since a creature can't technically drop their armor, they'll be forced to have disadvantage on all of their attack rolls and ability checks until the start of your next turn, making it even harder for the creature to force concentration checks without any outside assistance. However, not every creature is going to have metal on them, meaning the overall usefulness of the spell is greatly diminished in campaigns where you might be fighting beasts more than humanoids. However, when this spell does become relevant, it can feel like the most powerful thing in the world, considering it does so much. Even if a creature is using a melee weapon, they can still be urged to drop it or take unavoidable fire damage, and a creature without its weapon is a creature without a reliable way of defending itself. The reason this spell only takes number 3 on this list is because of how situational Heat Metal is overall. It relies a bit too much on what your enemies are wearing and what kind of equipment enemies will be having as well, whereas these next 2 spells don't have to worry about any of that kind of thing. And at number 2, we have Fireball. This iconic 3rd level spell deals a whopping 8d6 fire damage. Half of that if they succeed a dexterity saving throw, to creatures in a 20-foot radius sphere that you create at a point of your choosing within 150 feet. In addition to that, the fire spreads around corners, making this spell tougher to avoid than other spells while also igniting flammable objects in the area that aren't being worn or carried. Now, for a 3rd level spell, Fireball deals a really strong amount of damage that's beaten out by very few spells until you gain access to 7th level spells, where things like Draconic Transformation, a spell where one of its key features allows you to basically deal Fireball damage as force damage as a bonus action, start becoming available. But a lot of times Fireball is just more generally useful because of how huge the radius is, and how easy it is to use the spell. Because, unlike all the other spells on this list so far, general ease of use along with a large capacity to deal damage tends to win you the game more often than trying to control your enemies with things like Flaming Sphere, or locking them down with things like Wall of Fire. Fireball is just immediate, on-demand damage that you can just throw out as soon as you reach level 5 as a spellcaster, and can instantly win a lot of encounters as a result. There are very few situations where a well-placed Fireball wouldn't work better than most other spells. Cone of Cold deals 1 more average point of damage than a Fireball upcasted to the same level can, and technically can cover more ground with it, but because it's on a Constitution saving throw, the worst stat to target in the game, it's usually more worth it to just use Fireball instead. The only exception, of course, is if you're going against enemies that resist or outright immune to fire damage, which a lot of creatures are. Then opting for something else tends to work better, as with most spells of the game. But as blasting spells with a huge radius and damage, this is one of the best spells you can take early on in the game if you really want to pop off, as it will likely remain relevant for most, if not all, of the campaign. And at number 1, we have Meteor Swarm. This 9th level spell is the highest damaging spell in the game, sporting an amazing 20d6 fire damage and 20d6 bludgeoning damage to targets that fail their dex save against it, half on a success. The spell conjures 4 meteors at different points you choose, which deal damage in a 40-foot radius sphere, easily doubling the radius of Fireball for a single meteor, and has an outstanding 1-mile range as you can choose to play with the spell. The only downside of the spell is that creatures can only take the damage of the spell 1 time per casting, meaning you can't just overlap the radius of all 4 meteors to bombard your opponent for 160d6 damage. But being able to effectively clear an entire army of creatures in a single cast is quite a feat worth talking about. Not a lot of creatures can survive taking an average of 140 damage unless they're very beefy and very big, in which case they would start the fight down a lot of hit points. Even if creatures succeed in making their dexterity saving throws against the spell, they are still taking a huge chunk of damage no matter what. A Fireball upcast at 9th level only deals an average of 49 fire damage if we want to put the tremendous damage potential of Meteor Swarm into perspective. And even if there are creatures immune to fire damage, Meteor Swarm still deals an average of 70 bludgeoning damage regardless. Meaning that you don't really have to worry about fire immunity as long as you're using this spell as a means to blast as many enemies as possible, unless every enemy is immune to fire damage, in which case you may consider a different spell, but not likely if you're going for area coverage. Even though this spell is only obtainable very late in a campaign, it outshines pretty much every other spell you would have obtained so far, since your enemies would be dead before you'd ever get a chance to use other spells with substantial amounts of damage. So, if you're looking for a fire spell for the purpose of devastating an entire battlefield, then the power of Meteor Swarm is unmatched by far. Most spellcasters gain the ability to cast 6th level spells at level 11. So in this list, we'll be going over 10 of the best 6th level spells you might be able to pick up once you get there. Starting off at number 10, we have Otuluk's Freezing Sphere. This spell is just a huge AoE with a 60-foot radius that deals 10d6 cold damage to all targets that fail a Constitution saving throw, taking half as much on a success. As this spell has a 300-foot range, you can throw this very far away in order to make sure it doesn't hit you or any of your allies. Because if you use this thing anywhere near the battlefield, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have some friendly fire, due to its 60-foot radius, which is gigantic. It's literally 3 times as big as a fireball. Although it does deal less damage than a fireball if you simply upcast it to 6th level. But you're giving up a little bit of damage on this thing in order to just have a massive range and radius. Some other niche uses of Freezing Sphere is it can also freeze bodies of water, so you can throw it into a lake in order to freeze a large amount of it, or even use it to freeze a river so you can just walk across. The ice lasts for 1 minute and even traps creatures that were in the water when it got frozen, requiring them to make a strength check in order to break free. You could also choose not to fire the ability and just keep it as a small globe the size of a sling bullet, where at any time you or a creature that you give the globe to can throw it for the full effect. Or you can even launch it with a sling to have a longer range, since if you throw it as a globe, it only has a maximum range of 40 feet, where it explodes and has the same exact effect as if you casted it normally. You can also set down the globe and have it shatter itself after 1 minute, so you can set up a trap with it if you so choose. Another thing you can do is, if you have the 9th level spell Time Stop, you can actually create multiple Freezing Spheres during the Time Stop, as it's one of the few ways to prepare extra damage during a Time Stop, because it doesn't require concentration. You can also just hand the globes off to friendly party members who can throw them as well. Now, there is another spell with the same radius called Circle of Death, where it deals the exact same damage as the 3rd level spell Fireball, at 86, but with a 60-foot radius, however, with only a 150-foot range instead of the 300 feet that Otuluk's Freezing Sphere has. But Circle of Death is necrotic damage, which is not as resisted as cold damage. However, they both target Constitution saves, which are typically pretty bad saves to target, because most monsters have a high Constitution score. So if you're just looking for a wide radius blast spell that doesn't require too much complicated thinking or concentrations, Otuluk's Freezing Sphere and Circle of Death are kind of the 2 options available at 6th level. And at number 9, we have Globe of Invulnerability. This spell creates a 10-foot radius sphere around you where you and anyone else inside of it are immune to 5th level or lower spells from outside the barrier. However, you can cast spells inside the barrier as much as you want, including to attack other creatures. So, the main benefit of Globe of Invulnerability, since it does require full action and your concentration to keep it up, is if you really don't want to be counterspelled. Because one of the little niches of Globe of Invulnerability is the fact that it doesn't matter if the spell is upcast or not, it only counts the spell's base level. So even if an enemy creature casts Counterspell at the 6th level, to bypass the 5th level limit, you're still immune to it because it was originally a 3rd level spell. It also protects you from AoE effects, so if someone tries to throw a fireball at you, you're just straight up immune to it. Being able to become immune to spells is pretty great. The problem is there aren't a lot of spellcasters in the game casting spells on players, and technically a dragon's flame breath is not counted as a spell, so it will hit you through a Globe of Invulnerability no problem. And also, this spell does require a full action to cast as well as your concentration to keep up, so you really have to give up your first round of combat in order to gain its effects. And the spell itself can be counterspelled anyway, so there's a chance you won't even be able to get it up if you're trying to not be counterspelled. There is a way to mitigate this a bit, however, due to the range of Counterspell, as it has a range of 60 feet, so if you cast this and then let the enemies come to you, it could still help you out. This brings us to the second issue with this spell, in that creatures can just kind of walk into the globe. So if they want to beat you up in melee, they can. Also, Globe of Invulnerability can be dispelled with Dispel Magic, even though it's a 3rd level spell. And that's because the target is the Globe of Invulnerability itself, and not something inside the globe. Now, there is another pretty good defensive spell that was also added recently called Fizzbang's Platinum Shield, which doesn't give you immunity to magic like Globe of Invulnerability, but only requires a bonus action to cast, and it lets you grant a friendly target a +2 to their AC, resistance to 5 common damage types, and evasion, where you take no damage if you succeed a dexterity save from a spell or effect which would normally take half damage. You can move this shield around to another target with subsequent bonus actions as long as you keep your concentration up. So when it comes to protecting yourself with 6th level spells, these 2 spells do a pretty good job. But there is one at a higher spot on this list that is just a little bit better. And at number 8, we have Chain Lightning. This is a spell which can hit a total of 4 targets, 1 creature of your choice within 150 feet, as well as 3 others that are within 30 feet of the first target. A Chain Lightning deals an average of 45 damage to each target. Now, when you compare this with single target spells, if you look at 5th level, we have Animate Objects, which deals an average of 65 damage to 1 target in 1 turn. So, from a single target point of view, it's definitely not as good as a spell of a lower level, or even other spells at the same level, as Disintegrate deals 75 damage on average to a single target, and Harm deals 49 damage, and even Summon Fiend deals 48 damage if all 3 of its multi-attacks hit. Although, Chain Lightning is not single target damage, it bounces to 3 other targets for full damage. So, if you're able to hit 4 targets with Chain Lightning, that's 180 damage on average. Now, if you just hit a whole bunch of creatures with either Ultralux Freezing Sphere or Circle of Death, you're going to deal way more than 180 damage. However, this is where the main benefit of Chain Lightning comes in, and that's the fact that you can fire it into the middle of your martial characters and not hit a single one of them, while hitting 4 targets of your choice. It's one of the few AoE spells that has built-in friendly fire protection, and it deals a lot of damage to those 4 targets. And even if you simply hit 2 targets, you beat all of the single target spells and damage at this level, which don't last over multiple turns. Because technically Sunbeam can use its effect 10 times with 1 spell slot, as it hits all creatures within a 60-foot line and deals 27 damage on average to each target. So, eventually, 1 casting of Sunbeam can beat the damage of Chain Lightning as well, but Sunbeam doesn't have friendly fire protection either. So, while you may technically be able to do more damage with one of the other AoE spells by hitting a whole bunch more targets, and you can technically hit harder with some of the single target spells if you're fighting a single target, a lot of combat encounters don't really have massive amounts of enemies anyway. So you might be hitting all of your opponents with 1 casting of a Chain Lightning, and getting the maximum amount of damage from those 4 targets hit. So the usefulness of the spell is dependent on your campaign and what creatures you're fighting, but in pretty much every game that I've ran, Chain Lightning would be able to hit around half of the creatures in a standard combat encounter, whereas the other AoE spells that can hit all of them would also be hitting the rest of your party as well. And at number 7, we have Hero's Feast. This is a really expensive spell to cast as it consumes 1,000 gold pieces in materials each time you use it. However, when used, it allows 12 people to spend an hour eating the food it conjures, which cures them of all diseases and poisons, and makes them immune to poison and being frightened for 24 hours. As well as giving them advantage in all their wisdom saving throws during the same duration. And lastly, it increases their maximum hit points by 2d10, also healing them for the same amount. Now, what's really great about this ability is that it lasts for 24 hours, so technically, you could use this at the end of the day with a spare spell slot and carry the benefits over into the next day, just having a passive immunity to poison in the frightened condition, which are 2 things that come up a lot when fighting against average monsters, as well as having advantage in all wisdom saves, which is even better, as wisdom saves are often the most important ones to succeed, as failure typically results in a lost control effect instead of pure damage like a dexterity save does. And the maximum hit point increase you gain stacks with other maximum hit points increases, like Aid, as well as temporary hit points since it technically doesn't count as temp HP. So, if you're looking for an excellent buff to give your whole party, and you have more gold than you know what to do with, casting Hero's Feast at the end of every night with a spare 6th level spell slot is going to give you the most bang for your buck. And at number 6, we have Heal. This is a healing spell which is only available to clerics and druids, and all it does is use your action in order to cause 1 target to regain 70 hit points, as well as remove 3 minor status debuffs. When it comes to a healing spell that is just very efficient for its spell level, Heal is definitely one of the best, and is going to be very useful for getting a party member to full health around the 11th level when you can first take this spell, and even a significant amount of health at higher levels in later tiers of play. The status debuffs it cures aren't super common or very important, but it is a nice little bit of icing on the cake, although you will still need greater restoration in order to remove all the more nasty effects. And at number 5, we have Oto's Irresistible Dance. This is a spell that, when cast on a target, causes them to start dancing in place, where during their turn they have to use all of their movement to dance in place, and it also gives them disadvantage on dexterity saves and all of their attack rolls, and more importantly, making it so that all attack rolls against them are done at advantage. And if the creature wants to end the effect on themselves, they have to wait until their turn, where they have to use an action in order to perform a wisdom saving throw, ending the effect on a success. Now, you may be thinking that just basically applying the restrained condition to a target is not worth a 6th level spell slot, especially since the target still gains their actions and doesn't actually stop them from anything other than moving. However, one of the things to note about this spell is the fact that there's no saving throw for applying the spell in the first place. Unless the target is immune to being charmed, they're affected by the spell as soon as it's cast on them, so it bypasses a boss monster's legendary resistances. That's the power of this spell, being able to place a debuff on a target which gives you advantage to all your party's attacks, without having to worry about a legendary resistance stopping the control effect. And it can even cause them to lose their turn if they choose to use an action in order to end the effect, as they don't gain an automatic try at the end of the turn on damage like most other control spell effects have. And at number 4, we have Mass Suggestion. This is a spell that basically casts the 2nd level spell suggestion spell, but on 12 targets. It doesn't require concentration, and lasts for 24 hours. As long as the creatures can hear and understand you and aren't immune to being charmed, you can give them a command that's 2 sentences or less, which they have to follow as long as it's reasonable and they fail the wisdom saving throw. So, if you tell them all to just kill themselves, then the effect won't take hold. However, if you encounter an enemy group of creatures, and there's 12 or less of them, you can basically instantly win the encounter by just telling them all to go away. You can just tell them to go take a hike, go walk in the other direction, go home, whatever you can think of, because it's real easy to just instantly end an encounter with Mass Suggestion, especially since you're able to use it on up to 12 targets at once. And if you're creative, you can do even more with those 2 sentences. It works on big creatures as well, so you can convince an entire group of giants to stop attacking a town, so even at the higher levels it remains useful. Although all the giants would have to be within 60 feet of you when you cast the spell, so positioning would be quite important. Even if you can't hit everyone, immediately eliminating half of an enemy party with Mass Suggestion is pretty good crowd control. And if you want to be more devious with Mass Suggestion, you can increase the duration of the effect by quite a lot by upcasting the spell, where it can last up to 10 days if you upcast at the 7th level, and a year and a day if cast at 9th. And at number 3, we have Eye Bite. This is a spell that lasts for 1 minute, where every turn you get to choose one of the 3 crowd control effects you want to inflict on a target within 60 feet of you, where you choose a target who must succeed a wisdom saving throw, and on failure, they either fall asleep until they take damage or are shaken awake by someone else, be panicked, where on each of their turns they have to take the dash action to run away from you, or you can sicken the target, which gives them disadvantage on their attacks and ability checks. They get to make another wisdom saving throw at the end of each of their turns in order to end the effect early, but even a single turn of this effect can be devastating. Sicken is not as good as the other 2, because being able to put someone to sleep just completely removes them from the encounter, or allows one of your allies to hit with advantage and an automatic crit if they decide to attack anyway. And if you panic them, you can also attack them while they're running away, and they're not able to break the frightened effect unless they're both able to move more than 60 feet away and out of line of sight of you. So, depending on where you fear a target, they might not be able to meet the conditions to break the effect, and you can just fear them into a corner where they can't do anything, and you can attack them without them being able to use their actions to fight back, as they're forced to use their action to dash. And unlike the other spells that have similar effects, what makes Eye Bite especially good is the fact that you can just keep doing this every turn with a single spell slot. So basically, you get to spend each of your turns trying to control a different target, but you only have to spend a single spell slot to do so, instead of having to cast a whole bunch of other control spells using more spell slots. If a target succeeds a save, you can't target them again unless you recast the spell, but still, the main benefit of Eye Bite is that you just get so much mileage out of one spell slot, even if you're only affecting one target per turn. And at number 2, we have Contingency. This is a spell which has the effect that when you cast it, you can choose one of the other spells you can cast that's 5th level or below, and then create a condition where the spell will be cast instantly, once the condition is met, no matter how vague or specific you are. Although there are some limitations to it, the spell you choose can only be one that requires one action to cast, and it has to be one that can target you. And it also uses both your 6th level spell slot to cast Contingency in addition to the spell slot of the spell that you want the Contingency to cast. It also costs 1,500 gold pieces to cast, but that is not consumed when you use it. So, what makes Contingency really good is the fact that it lasts for 10 days with no concentration. So just like with Hero's Feast, you can just use this on a day where you have a spare 6th level spell slot, in order to set it up for later use. For example, you could create the condition that, if you drop below 20 hit points, you cast Otoluk's Resilient Sphere, which is a 4th level spell that basically encases you in a bubble that makes you impervious to harm. Though a Disintegrate spell can crack this bubble, nothing else can get through it. You could also make the condition very simple so that you just activate whatever you want as a free action. Like, if I blink my eyes twice in quick succession, then Invisibility is cast on me. Some people also like to use Contingency to let them cast Dimension Door. However, some DMs would require the direction of the Dimension Door to be set when you cast Contingency, making this option not available to all players. Contingency is a spell that really allows you to use your imagination. So while normally you can't use Otoluk's Resilient Sphere to save yourself, as it requires an action to cast, but it can be used to save yourself with Contingency, as it's just a simple condition. You can get really specific with it if you want, and have something like, if I cast Counterspell in reaction to a spell targeting me, and that Counterspell fails, and the spell targeting me has a lingering effect on me, then cast Dispel Magic. And since the effect lasts for 10 days, you will eventually have a day where you have a spare 6th level spell slot. So once you have Contingency, chances are you're always going to have one of them active. And at number 1, we have Mental Prison. This is basically a single target damaging ability which has the highest amount of potential single target damage of any spell until 9th level, where only Meteor Swarm beats it in single target damage. Even beating out 7th level spells, like Finger of Death or Delayed Blast Fireball that has been fully charged. As what this spell does is one target within 60 feet that's not immune to being charmed has to succeed an intelligence saving throw, where if they fail, they take 5d10 psychic damage, and they are immediately surrounded in an illusion that can be whatever you want. But whatever the illusion is, the target can't see or hear anything beyond it. And if the target moves out of the illusion, attacks it, or reaches any body part through it, they immediately take an additional 10d10 psychic damage and the spell ends. However, if they succeed the original saving throw, they still take 5d10 psychic damage and then the spell ends with no illusion. So, if they fail and then walk through the illusion, they take 15d10 psychic damage, or around 83 damage on average, which is 8 more damage than the Disintegrate spell, and 21 more damage than Finger of Death, which is a 7th level single target blast spell. One of the main benefits of Mental Prison over some of the other harder hitting high level single target spells is that it actually deals damage on a failed save, whereas Disintegrate simply fizzles out and does nothing. It also targets an excellent saving throw with Intelligence, which a vast majority of creatures in the monster manual are lacking in. Really, the only point against Mental Prison is the fact that it doesn't work on creatures who are immune to being charmed, which a lot of boss monsters sadly are. But still, if you land a Mental Prison on something, chances are they're going to fail the saving throw and then take a ton of damage, unless they have legendary resistances to auto-succeed. But they will still take 28 damage on average from the initial 5d10, which is about the damage that a Fireball deals to a single target. Now, a single target damaging ability probably isn't better than Contingency, Eye Bite, or even Mass Suggestion, which can completely end an encounter. But it is the hardest hitting single target spell into the 9th level, and a lot of people like to just do damage with their spells rather than using the overly complicated control spells, which are technically better. So, when it comes to big single target damage, you can't really beat Mental Prison. 9th level spells are the highest level spells in the game, and since you usually don't get 9th level spell slots until level 17, most people don't get to use them very often. However, in case you do get to use them, here are some of the best ones you can possibly pick up. And at number 10, we have Psychic Scream. Psychic Scream is an AoE which affects up to 10 targets as you can see within 90 feet of you. And if they fail an Intelligence saving throw, they take 14d6 psychic damage, and then they get stunned until they succeed that saving throw. And 14d6 damage for a 9th level spell slot is equivalent to casting Fireball at 9th level. So if all you care about is damage and you just like to upcast Fireball, then Psychic Scream will provide you the same amount of damage, while also having a stun component, and having a built-in no friendly fire clause, since it only affects targets of your choice, just as long as they have an intelligence score of 2 or higher, which most things do. And the cool thing about the stun is that it can theoretically last forever, as they don't get unstunned until they succeed an intelligence saving throw at the end of their turn. And also, if they die from the damage, their head explodes, which is just a neat bonus. However, there are some problems with this ability, mainly that it's compared to all other 9th level spells, and some of them are downright broken in comparison to a Fireball that can stun. And also, if you just want to deal damage, there's another 9th level spell which deals way more damage than Psychic Scream, but doesn't have a built-in friendly fire suppressor like Psychic Scream. Although even then, there are other lower level spells you can cast which deal more damage than Psychic Scream. So the main utility of picking up the spell is the fact that it has decent damage, since its damage is equivalent to a 9th level Fireball, and it has that stun component, which is definitely the most useful part of it. Although with how broken some of the higher spots are, you'll see why this is at the lowest spot at number 10. And at number 9, we have Invulnerability. This spell has a very simple effect, probably the least amount of attacks out of all the 9th level spells, where you're just straight up immune to damage until the spell ends. This spell itself lasts for 10 minutes and requires 500 gold to cast. However, when you're 17th level, 500 gold isn't that big of a deal. Although there is a little caveat to Invulnerability, and the fact that it only makes you immune to damage and nothing else. So if you're targeted by negative effects which might control your character, like a Psychic Scream and you fail the saving throw, then you can still be stunned. Or have your character mind controlled with a Dominate monster, or even charmed by a 2nd level suggestion. Although most monsters in the monster manuals don't have super fancy special effects, so being able to make yourself immune to damage for 10 minutes will basically make you invincible to a lot of enemies. And the fact that it requires concentration isn't a big deal if you never take damage. So if you're a wizard and you want to fight the warlord barbarian of an enemy kingdom one-on-one, you could probably beat them with a dagger as long as you're able to deal enough damage within 10 minutes, as they won't be able to hurt you. And the utility of becoming immune to damage for 10 minutes is just very good, especially since it can allow you to slowly whittle down any foe that doesn't have a way to control you outside of dealing damage. And at number 8, we have Mass Polymorph. This ability essentially allows you to cast the 4th level spell Polymorph on up to 10 different targets within 120 feet, and these targets can be friendly or unfriendly creatures, where if they're unfriendly, they can succeed a saving throw in order to not be forcefully transformed. And when you transform something by the Polymorph spell, the game statistics, including the mental ability scores, are replaced by the statistics of the chosen beast. Which means, if you mass polymorph a group of enemy targets, you can just choose to turn them into a whole bunch of rats, and then just kind of ignore them for the whole hour. So it's basically a way to instantly disable up to 10 enemy targets, or act as a buffer to some of your teammates. Now, mass polymorph doesn't work exactly like the normal polymorph. There are a couple of key differences. For one, it allows you to turn a creature into a beast that has a challenge rating equal to its original challenge rating or lower, or if they are a player who has character levels instead, you can only turn them into a beast which has a CR rating equal to half or lower than their level. Whereas the original polymorph spell allows you to transform a player into an animal that has an equal amount of CR. You see, challenge ratings are not equal to character levels, as generally a whole group of 5th level characters, for example, should be able to defeat a CR 5 creature if they work together. So if you're able to turn one character into a CR 5 creature at level 5, then they're instantly stronger than everyone else in their party, because the CR ratings are slightly balanced around being fought by multiple characters. CR ratings aren't super balanced though, so this is kind of a rough estimation, but a monster's CR is almost always stronger than a player's character of the same level. And the other difference is that it only grants the polymorph targets temporary HP instead of giving them a second health bar. So with the original polymorph, they basically get the health of the animal they turn into, and then if they lose that health, they transform back into their original state and still have their original health as well. With mass polymorph, it instead just gives the target a number of temporary hit points equal to that beast's health, which is a difference because it doesn't allow you to do power word kill shenanigans, while still providing a lot of extra hit points to chew through if you're using it on a friendly target to give them extra health. And since you don't really get 9th level spells until level 17 anyway, if you want to use mass polymorph on your friends, you can still turn them all into T-Rexes if you want, since the T-Rex is only CR 8, which is half of 16. Or giant apes if you want to keep their mental statistics, since the T-Rex only has an intelligence of 2, while the giant ape has an intelligence of 7, and is only 1 CR rating lower than a T-Rex. So if you want to turn everyone in your party into a T-Rex, I'm not sure how useful that would be if everyone's at 17th level, which is kind of why mass polymorph is lower on this list rather than one of the best. It is a neat 9th level spell, but as 9th level spells go, it's not as good as some of the better ones, which is kind of a theme for some of the earlier spots on this list. They do really amazing things, it's just they have to compete with some of the higher spots, which are even more amazing and downright broken. But if you really like the idea of turning your party into T-Rexes, that way you can get the extra 130 temporary hit points, then this is definitely something that could be done. Although most monsters you fight in tier 4 levels will be immune to the damage of a T-Rex, so there's always that to worry about. And at number 7, we have Time Stop. This ability allows you to stop time for 1d4 plus 1 turns, where you're able to take a number of turns equal to the amount of turns you're able to stop time, unless you do an action which affects another creature or object, or if you move more than 1,000 feet from where you cast the spell. So Time Stop can be an excellent way for you to just get out of any situation, because there's not much anyone can do about you stopping time and just running away. One of the most useful applications of the ability, though, is being able to set up a whole bunch of buffs on yourself, which is why there's lots of theory crafted online about which are the best abilities you can cast during a time stop, which make your character a lot more effective mid-combat, which is usually not possible unless you're able to prep before combat for whatever reason. So if you want to use Time Stop to just buff yourself, you can use it on things like Mage Armor, Mirror Image, Blur, Fire Shield, Invisibility, True Seeing, or even Crown of Stars. Generally, you want to go for buffs that don't require concentration, and then maybe one buff that requires concentration. If you want to use it to do damage, what you can do is just use every turn to cast O'Toole's Freezing Sphere into the little globe form. Then just have your fighter in the group come over to you and pick them all up and sling them at an opponent with their multi-attack. Or, if you want a creative combo, you could cast Sickening Radiance on something and then just put them in a Force Cage, since Sickening Radiance doesn't actually affect the creature until their turn starts. It won't end the time stop prematurely. Alternatively, you can sub out Sickening Radiance with Cloud Kill, Delayed Blast Fireball, Bigsby's Hand, Contingency, or Faithful Hound, as all of those don't immediately end time stop either, and can be used before a Force Cage in order to trap a creature inside with one of those effects. So there's lots of fun things you can do in a time stop even with its limitations. Although it definitely requires a lot of prep work beforehand, since it's real easy to accidentally end time stop early if you're just blasting things. And at number 6, we have Foresight. This ability allows you to buff a creature so they gain advantage on all their attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws for 8 hours. Additionally, they can't be surprised, and other creatures have disadvantage on attack rolls against them. And since you can cast it on other people, and it doesn't require concentration, it's just an excellent spell to cast on one of your martial classes. More specifically, someone who has an ability like Sharpshooter or Great Weapon Master, where they regularly take a -5 to their attack rolls in order to deal much more damage. So if you give this to a fighter with Sharpshooter, they'll have advantage on all of their attack rolls and be much more likely to actually land some of those big hits, while also having really good protection since it gives them advantage on saving throws and disadvantage on attack rolls against them. It's basically one of the best buff spells you can give someone in a game, because the effect itself is just really good for pretty much every class, and it basically lasts for a full adventuring day. One of the problems with 9th level spell slots is that you usually only get one of them, so if that one spell's effect can benefit someone for an entire adventuring day, then you get a lot of mileage out of it, which just makes Foresight one of the good ones to pick up. And at number 5, we have Meteor Swarm. This ability is just a giant AoE, which with a 1-mile range allows you to designate 4 different points you can see, where each creature that's within 40-foot radius of those points takes 40 d6 damage, half fire and half bludgeoning if they fail a saving throw, or half as much on a success. This spell only affects a creature 1 time total, so you can't petal one target 4 times. However, even with each creature only being hit once, Meteor Swarm is the hardest hitting single target ability in the game, dealing 140 damage on average, while also being a gigantic AoE. It has the potential to be the hardest hitting AoE spell as well, but Storm of Vengeance, another 9th level spell, technically hits way more targets, so it might lose out to Storm of Vengeance in doing the most amount of damage for a spell being cast, or maybe not. But whatever the case, if all you want to do is just use your 9th level spell slot for some bombastic damage, Meteor Swarm is the go-to spell. It just kind of blows Psychic Scream out of the water when it comes to dealing damage. Although Psychic Scream has the benefit where you can allow it to not hit friendly targets, whereas Meteor Swarm hits everything, and has such a large radius that this chance to hit one of your party members unintentionally is pretty high. And at number 4, we have Shape Change. This ability is like a polymorph that you can only cast on yourself, where you can turn to any creature that has a challenge rating equal to your level or lower, just as long as it's not a construct or undead, and you've seen that creature at least once. And what's great about this ability is it allows you to turn into things besides beasts, as generally, beasts in the monster manual are kind of balanced around the fact that they know players gain access to these beasts through a whole bunch of different kinds of spells and abilities. Other creatures don't really have these same balance restrictions or limitations. So most non-beast creatures are just stronger than other beasts of the same challenge rating. And Shape Change also allows you to keep your mental statistics, as you don't lose your intelligence, wisdom, or charisma score. But you gain the creatures pretty much everything else, their health, special abilities, innate spellcasting if they have any, but not legendary actions or layer actions. And lastly, every turn you're allowed to change your Shape Change into something else, with the only restriction that you can't gain any more hit points than you gained from your first form. So you can't constantly swap forms in order to get a new health bar every turn, but you can swap forms to whatever you want every turn to gain new abilities or different innate spells. Because as a little distinction, you can't use a creature's spellcasting trait, but you can use the innate spellcasting trait if the creature has it. So if you turn into a Planeteer, for example, you're able to cast all of its spells since it has the innate spellcasting trait, just as long as none of them require concentration, because you're concentrating on a spell to do this. And the Planeteer is just a really good option to turn into, too. It can also use Healing Touch 4 times a day, it has passive True Sight, and the ability to passively know if someone is lying, so an excellent out-of-combat tool for social situations. It adds extra radiant damage to all of its attacks, and it has a baseline fly speed of 120 feet, which is really good. With this, you can fly and attack something and then go behind full cover every turn. Some other creatures you can turn into with innate spells include the Elder Brain, the Ultraloth, or the Rakshasa, in order to gain its limited spell immunity. You can also turn into a purple worm in order to create tunnels that your party can follow behind. You can turn into a Merilith to have a reaction every turn in combat, or just go into an adult gold dragon for fun, which is one of the strongest dragons you can turn into that you can possibly turn into at your level, which also has the shape change feature. You also gain the legendary resistances that a creature has, so every time you shape change into a new one, you get all of those new legendary resistances, as it doesn't prevent you from using those, only legendary actions. So shape change has a lot of really good creatures you can turn into in a lot of very versatile situations to kind of become a better creature than whatever your character is, honestly. And at number 3, we have Prismatic Wall. This is a spell which is kind of like a stronger Force Cage. It is definitely the final form of the spells which allow you to trap creatures or create barriers, like Wall of Force or Force Cage. And what it does is summon a wall that's 90 feet long, 30 feet high, and 1 inch thick. Or you create a sphere with a diameter of 30 feet. And wherever you designate the wall within 60 feet, if the wall passes through any creatures when it's forming, then the wall will just fail to form and your spell slot will be wasted. Which is kind of extreme since Force Cage just pushes creatures outside of it if it hits any creatures, but whatever. Prismatic Wall's pretty big, so you can pretty easily just put this over a creature, as long as it fits within the 30-foot dome if you're trying to trap it. When you create the wall, you can designate any friendly targets you want to be immune to its effects, so they can just pass through it no problem. And if an enemy creature tries to go through the wall, then it's subjugated to all 7 of its layers' effects, where each of its layers has its own description of what it does and how much damage it deals, where it deals a total of 50 d6 damage if you go through all 7 layers, and has a chance to petrify, blind, and teleport a target to another dimension in the process. So it deals an average of 175 damage to a creature that walks through all 7 layers, and it's the ultimate spell in order to force creatures to walk through it. If you combo this with a reverse gravity trap, and place a dome above your opponent's enemies' heads, as you can put it in the air, then if they fail the reverse gravity and fall into it, they'll go through the wall 2 times as they fall into the air. Then you can just end reverse gravity in order for them to fall again through the 2 walls of the dome. And there's not too many creatures which can survive going through a prismatic wall 4 times. Alternatively, you can just create it like a wall and just get a lot of mileage out of abilities that allow you to push creatures through it, or just trap them in a dome, and you'll have 10 minutes before the wall goes away, since the wall can't be dispelled normally and is immune to anti-magic effects. Plus, one of the layers blocks all spells from going through. As the way you destroy the wall normally is you have to deal at least 25 points of cold damage to break its red layer. Then you have to use a strong wind in order to destroy its orange layer. Then deal 60 points of force damage to destroy the yellow layer. Just a reminder, with all these damage values, you kind of have to do all the damage at once, unless your DM allows you to deal the damage accumulative. So it's pretty obvious the yellow layer was designed to be hit with a disintegration spell. Then if you wish to break the green layer, you have to use the Pass Wall spell, which is a 5th level random spell that you probably won't have, or some similar effect in order to break it. Then you have to deal 25 fire damage to the blue wall, cast the Daylight spell or a similar spell in order to break the indigo wall, and finally the violet wall can be broken with Dispel magic. So the way you actually destroy this wall normally is akin to running a puzzle or encounter, and is an excellent spell to give a villain if you're a DM running a campaign, in order to force the players to work together finding ways to destroy the wall. Of course, if you're a player and just using this on an opponent, chances are an average enemy is not going to have all the beans to destroy all 7 layers, and will have to find some other way around the wall or just kind of brute force through all the damage and hope they don't get petrified. The Prismatic Wall has the potential to be one of the highest damage dealing single target abilities in the game, although it definitely requires creative use in order to force an enemy to actually try to go through it. And since you can designate friendly players to not be affected by the wall at all, you can just have your party members go in and out of the wall in order to attack and hide behind it for full protection. This powerful and incredibly complicated ability is definitely worth a 9th level spell slot, as you can kind of build a whole campaign around the ability to an extent, or at least make a very exciting final boss fight with it. And at number 2, we have True Polymorph. This spell allows you to turn a creature or object into any creature or object you want, although with a couple of rules and stipulations depending on what you're trying to turn them into. And also, if you're able to maintain concentration on this transformation for a full hour, then the effect becomes permanent. So if you're level 17 and have the ability to cast the spell, what you can do is turn yourself into an adult gold dragon. And the gold dragon can use its shape change feature to turn into something else. So if you want, you can turn yourself permanently into an adult gold dragon, and then have the ability to use its shape change spell that I talked about earlier. Basically, an unlimited amount of times per day. And then once you get to level 20, you can instead turn into an ancient brass dragon, who is able to accomplish the same thing. Although you'll only be able to turn to CR 20 and lower creatures. And some caveats to being able to shape change as a dragon is that the dragon shape change doesn't grant them any extra health, and also does not allow you to turn back into yourself with all of your spell slots, as True Polymorph completely replaces all of your statistics with the new form. So what you can't do is transform yourself into Adult Gold Dragon, and then use its shape change feature to turn yourself back into your normal form in order to try to keep your spell slots, in addition to the new Gold Dragon's health. Although, if you turn into an Adult Gold Dragon, and then use its ability shape change to turn into something else that has spells, like the Planeteer, then you can use those spells in that new form. So if you wanted to, you could just take about a week in order to turn everyone in your party into an Adult Gold Dragon. That way they gain the benefits of the shape change ability. Or just being a Gold Dragon with its breath weapons and strong melee capabilities. Or not, because they do lose their character statistics and can't really do anything else that the Gold Dragon can't already do. Now, outside of Gold Dragons, what you can also do with True Polymorph is transform objects into creatures. And an object transformed into a creature in this way is friendly to in your party for the full duration. Although after the effect's duration ends and the effect becomes permanent, then the creature itself gets to choose if it wants to stay friendly to you or not. And if you transform an object into a creature, it can only be CR 9 or lower. So this turns True Polymorph into basically a summon spell that allows you to transform a random rock or tree nearby into a CR 9 or lower creature. And some of the best creatures you can choose are the Young Silver Dragon, if you just want a beatstick. Or if you want some spells, you can transform them into an Evoker, or an Abjurer, who have a lot of good spells that they can cast. The War Priest, if you need someone to heal your party, or the Hashalak Kori, which has the ability to possess something or cast Dominate Monster. And if your party is just really good at convincing the creature to stay friendly to you, you could spend a full week in order to have an army of 10 young silver dragons at your beck and call. Or just a whole extra party of adventurers, if you give yourself a War Priest, Invoker, and then a Champion. And then finally, you can transform creatures into objects, just as long as they're not magical objects. So, if you simply transform an enemy creature into an object that is required as part of a spell component, since most of those aren't magic objects, which consumes that object as part of the spell component, like, say, a diamond worth 300 gold, which then can be used in order to cast Revivify, consuming the component and thereby destroying whatever creature you turned into an object. Although seeing as most boss monsters have legendary resistances, they'll probably just use it in order to avoid being turned into something. So this isn't an excellent way to instantly defeat a big boss monster, but it is a pretty metal way to defeat pretty much anything else. So, True Polymorph allows you to turn your whole party into Adult Gold Dragons if you want. Or if you have a whole bunch of sidekicks with you that you picked up through your campaign, you can turn them into Adult Gold Dragons instead, or, other dragons in case they have lower levels, so that your other level 17 party members don't lose all of their full abilities. Or you can create an army of young silver dragons by just turning rocks or trees into dragons, or just turning an enemy creature into a material component and then just consuming it to destroy them instantly. There's a lot of very strong things you can perform with the spell, which would probably make it one of the strongest spells in the game if it wasn't for the number 1 spot, because there's so many other things you can do with True Polymorph, like turn someone into the CR 16 creature Titiphilis, who can cast Animate Dead at will, so you can have your very own undead army. The limitations are pretty much up to whatever your DM allows you to do, because remember, if the only thing your DM requires of you is to have seen the creature in order to transform them into it, as the spell itself doesn't have that requirement even though Shape Change does, if you're a 17 level adventurer, you should have access to some kind of scrying or clairvoyance in order to see any of these creatures. And at number 1, we have the Wish spell. The Wish spell basically turns you into a reality warper, as by default, the spell allows you to cast any spell of 8th level or lower while ignoring its materials or cast time. And outside of that, you can instead just use Wish for whatever you want, but whether that succeeds is entirely up to your DM. So if your DM lets you do literally whatever you want with Wish, you could use the Wish spell to completely end the campaign immediately and have all of your characters retire rich. Although there's always a downside where if you try to wish for something outside of 8th level or lower spells, there is a 33% chance you won't be able to cast Wish ever again. So, Let's go over some of the benefits of Wish if you only choose 8th level or lower spells to cast. One of the best things you can do is just cast Simulacrum, creating a copy of yourself. Then this new Simulacrum will have your 9th level spell slot, and you can use the Simulacrum in order to cast Wish for one of the options that's not an 8th level or lower spell. Normally, Simulacrum costs 1500 gold to cast and has a long 12-hour cast time. So you'd need the gold to do this for the first time, but you could just have your Simulacrum use the first Wish option to create 25,000 gold and then get your money back, and make a 23,500 gold profit, which can be used to fund more Simulacrums to cast more Wishes. And your Simulacrum is a separate entity from you and can't regain spell slots, so if it loses the ability to cast Wish, that's not a problem, as you just create another one tomorrow. So if you have some prep, what you can do is create a new Simulacrum every day, then have that Simulacrum use one of the fun effects of Wish, under the options of what you can cast outside of spells, in order to grant everyone in your party resistance to all types of damage, 1 type per casting of the spell per day, or just summon an enormous pile of cash every day, 25,000 gold at a time. And you can also grant everyone in your party immunity to a spell for 8 hours, which you can do right before a big boss fight. And these are things you can do without your DM being able to invoke monkey paw shenanigans, as they are listed within the spell itself as things it can just do. If you try to do something else, then the spell itself encourages the DM to just judge whether the spell happens or not, or to do something creative with how it fails, or to simply tell you that the spell fails because of what you're trying to wish for is just too much. So granting everyone in your party resistance to all damage with the Simulacrum every day is something you can totally do with rules as written, although it's definitely one of the cheesiest things you can do. Alternatively, you can cast Hallow instantly, which normally has a 24-hour cast time, and can make it so 5 types of creatures can't harm your party, and also make it so enemy creatures have vulnerability to a type of damage of your choice. You can cast Resurrection without material components, in order to more cheaply bring someone back to life. You can cast Awaken on a tree in order to have a Trent, or cast a Planner Binding at 8th level in order to control a creature for 180 days. As you are able to cast the spell you're duplicating up to the 8th level instead of just its base level. So Wish is the ultimate spell, where it's even broken within its rules as written, and becomes even more broken if your DM is a lot more lenient with what they allow you to wish for. So Wish is easily the best 9th level spell in the game, and you can run your entire campaigns around characters trying to find items that allow them to cast the spell a single time.